He collapsed to his knees on the train platform, a grown man, a hardened cowboy, a foreman who had never flinched from blizzard or blood or loss, and he wept in front of strangers. 7 years, 2,555 days, 312 letters sent to a woman who had never answered. And now she stood 3 feet away, trembling, her traveling bag in her hand, her eyes red from 6 days of crying on a train she almost didn't board. He pressed his forehead to her shoulder and broke open like a man who had been holding a dam together with his bare hands for 7 years and finally let go. Before we go back to where it all began, please subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us what city you are watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with us until the very end, because this is the kind of love story that only happens once. March 1892. Wyoming Territory. The bunkhouse smelled like tobacco and wet wool, and the wind outside was trying to tear the walls apart. It was a Sunday night in early March, cold enough to make the windows weep frost, and Caleb Walker sat at the far end of the long table with a sheet of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand. He was 18 years old. He had rough hands and a face that was already learning to be hard, and he was writing a letter to a woman he had never met. Around him, 3 ranch hands played cards by lamplight. Dutch Henderson, who was twice Caleb's age and had half his teeth, a man named Ruiz, who never spoke unless spoken to, and a kid named Percy, who had arrived 2 weeks ago from Kansas and still looked scared of the horses. The room smelled of bodies and old grease and the kind of boredom that settles into a man like weather. "You writing your sweetheart again, Walker?" Dutch's voice was the kind that carried without trying. He didn't look up from his cards when he said it, but Percy turned to look at Caleb, and even Ruiz shifted slightly in his chair. Caleb didn't answer right away. He dipped the pen again and kept his eyes on the page. "Don't have a sweetheart," he said. "Then who the hell you writing to every Sunday like clockwork?" "Someone I aim to meet someday." There was a pause. Dutch laid down a card slowly, like a man who was making sure everyone was paying attention. "You're writing a letter to a woman you've never met." "That's right." Dutch let out a laugh, the kind that said he genuinely could not believe what he was hearing. "That is the saddest damn thing I have ever heard in my life. And I once knew a man who fell in love with a mule." Percy laughed nervously. Ruiz didn't move. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't look up. "Mind your cards, Dutch." "I'm just saying, boy, a woman who doesn't know you exist and you're spending your Sunday writing to her like she's waiting by the mailbox. That's touched in the head." "Maybe," Caleb said quietly, "but I'm writing it anyway." He pressed the pen to the page and let the words come. "Dear Miss Bennett, my name is Caleb Walker. I am 18 years old. I work cattle in Wyoming Territory. I found your name in the church correspondence column of a newspaper someone left at the general store. It said, you are a school teacher in Boston. I have never been to Boston. I have never been anywhere except here. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because the wind is loud tonight and the bunkhouse feels smaller than usual. Maybe because I am tired of talking only to men who smell like horses. I don't expect you to write back. I just thought maybe somewhere in the world there is a person who might want to know that tonight in Wyoming the stars are so bright they look like holes punched through a black blanket. Respectfully, Caleb Walker." He folded it before he could change his mind, sealed it, put it in his jacket pocket, rode into Cheyenne the next morning and mailed it before he could think too hard about it, then rode back to the ranch and tried not to think about it at all. He failed, of course. Every day for the next 6 weeks, some part of his mind was tracking the mail, how long it would take to get to Boston, how long a reply would take to come back, whether she had even received it or whether it had been lost somewhere in the 1,000 miles of wilderness and railway between Wyoming and Massachusetts. He did not allow himself to check the post office more than once a week. That felt like a reasonable discipline. No reply came. 3 months passed. Spring arrived with mud and the smell of new grass and chaos being born in the cold early hours before dawn. Caleb worked from sunup to sundown, branding, fence mending, moving cattle between pastures, all the endless physical work of a ranch that did not stop for loneliness or heartache. He slept hard and dreamlessly most nights. But every Sunday he wrote, "Dear Miss Bennett, I don't know if you got my first letter. The mail out here is unreliable, or maybe you did receive it and decided not to answer. That's all right. I'm writing again anyway because today I saw something I thought you might want to hear about. There's a mare on this ranch that foaled last night. The colt came out backwards. Everyone said it was dead, but it stood up on shaking legs and it lived. The boss said, that's how it is out here. Most things try to kill you, and the ones that survive are tougher for it. I thought about that all day. about how hard things are sometimes and how we keep going anyway. I hope you're well, Caleb. He posted that one too, and the next one, and the one after that. 6 months became a year. You're wasting money on stamps, Dutch told him one evening, watching Caleb fold another letter with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from doing the same thing 50 times. She ain't real, boy. Or she is real and she thinks you're a fool. Caleb looked up. His face had started to develop the kind of stillness that hard men get, not cold exactly, but contained. Maybe I am a fool. Then why keep doing it? Because I'd rather be a fool who hopes than a man who gave up trying. Dutch spat tobacco juice into a tin can beside his boot. Hope don't keep you warm in winter, kid. Neither does bitterness. The room went quiet. Even the card game paused. Jessup, a young hand who had come on in the fall, broke the silence. What do you even write about? Caleb set down the pen. Anything, everything, what I saw that day, what I'm thinking about. Questions I've got nobody else to ask. Like what? Like, he stopped, thought. Like whether people are born lonely or whether they become that way. Whether a man can be good even if he never had anybody teach him how. Whether he caught himself. The men were staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to genuine concern. Jesus Walker, Dutch muttered. He sounded almost sorry for him. Caleb folded the letter and put it in his jacket. He didn't write again that night, but the next Sunday he did. By the third year, something fundamental shifted. He stopped expecting replies. The tight, anticipatory feeling in his chest when he approached the post office, the one that had made his hands slightly unsteady every time he reached for his mail, that feeling faded. Not because he stopped caring, but because the writing itself had become the point. It had become part of him the way breathing was part of him, the way the work was part of him. He wrote because the silence inside him needed somewhere to go, and the letters gave it a direction. And they changed, got longer, more honest. He wrote things he would never have said aloud to any living soul. Dear Eliza, he had started using her first name sometime in the second year without quite deciding to. I turned 21 today. The boss gave me a bottle of whiskey and told me I was a man now. I drank some of it, and it burned going down. And then I went outside and sat on the fence and wondered what it means to be a man. My father died when I was 6. I barely remember him. My mother raised me and my sister alone until she got sick. She died when I was 12. My sister went to live with an aunt in Missouri. I stayed because there was nowhere else to go. I think about them sometimes. I wonder if they'd be proud of who I became or disappointed that all I know how to do is work cattle and sleep in a bunkhouse with men who don't read and don't dream. Do you dream, Eliza? I hope you do. I hope wherever you are, you're not as lonely as I am. Yours, Caleb. He posted it and rode back to the ranch. Didn't cry, but came close. Year 4 brought the worst winter any man on that ranch could remember. Blizzards came in November and didn't stop until March. The cattle froze where they stood. The ranch lost nearly half the herd. In the first 6 weeks, you could ride out in the morning and find animals that had simply stopped standing upright in the drifts, solid as statues, their eyes frosted over. 2 of the hands quit and went south where the cold wasn't actively trying to murder you. Caleb stayed. He worked 18-hour days, longer sometimes, digging livestock out of snowdrifts with his bare hands when the tools wouldn't reach, burning carcasses before they could spread disease, hauling feed on a sled through chest-deep snow to reach animals too weak to move. His hands cracked and bled in the cold. His face turned to leather. He lost 20 pounds he didn't have to lose, and there was a period of 3 weeks in February when he genuinely wasn't sure he was going to make it. But every Sunday, every single one he wrote, Dear Eliza, we lost another 15 head today. I don't know if we'll make it through the winter. Don't know if I'll make it through, but I keep thinking about something my mother used to say. She said hardship doesn't break the people who were meant for this life. It reveals them. I used to believe that. Now I think sometimes hardship just breaks you, and the people watching call it strength because they can't tell the difference. I haven't broken yet. I hope you're warm wherever you are. I hope you're safe. I hope someone is taking care of you the way I wish I could. Caleb. Spring came eventually. It always did. The ranch recovered slowly. Caleb did not entirely. Something in him had frozen that winter and never quite thawed. Not in a way that made him hard or cruel, just quieter. More certain of things that had once felt uncertain. More certain of what mattered and what didn't. Dutch died during branding season that May. Heart attack right there in the corral in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. He went down between one moment and the next, and by the time anyone reached him, he was already gone. They buried him on a hill that overlooked the range. The whole crew stood in the cold wind, hats in hand, and nobody said very much. Caleb stood at the grave and realized he'd known that man for 6 years, had worked beside him through blizzard and drought and everything in between, and he had never once had a real conversation with him. Never asked about Dutch's life before the ranch. Never asked if he had family somewhere or what had brought him out here or whether he was happy. He was a name on a grave, that was all. That night, Caleb went back to his bunk and wrote the most honest letter he'd ever written. Dear Eliza, a man died today. I worked beside him for years. I didn't like him much and he didn't like me, but standing at his grave, I realized I never really knew him. Never asked him about his life before this ranch. Never asked if he had family. Never asked if he was happy. I don't want to die like that. Unknown, unremembered, a name on a hill that nobody visits. Is that why I write to you? Because I'm afraid of disappearing completely. I don't know. All I know is that when I write these letters, I feel less alone. Even if you never read them. Even if they go into a fire somewhere. Thank you for existing, Eliza, even if we never meet. Yours always, Caleb. In year 5, the boss offered Caleb the foreman position. He was 23. Most men didn't make foreman until their 30s, if they made it at all. The boss, Henry Morrison, a big-shouldered, slow-talking man who had been ranching this land for 20 years, made him the offer on a Tuesday morning without much ceremony. You're the best hand I've got, Morrison said. Better than men twice your age. You see the whole picture. You plan ahead. You don't quit. A pause. Also, you're the only one on this ranch who reads. Caleb accepted. With the promotion came a cabin, a small one-room structure on the far edge of the property with a wood stove and a bed that didn't creak and a south-facing window that let in the afternoon light. It was the first private space Caleb had ever had in his life. The first thing he did was build a shelf. The second thing he did was line up every letter he had ever written, the ones he'd kept copies of, folded and stacked in a box under his bunk all these years. There were over 200 of them. He sat on the floor of his new cabin and looked at the row of envelopes for a long time. What am I doing? He said out loud. The room didn't answer. He wrote another letter anyway. Year 6 brought a woman named Margaret. She was the boss's niece from Denver, 26 years old, practical and pretty, visiting the ranch for the summer. She noticed Caleb within her first week, not in a subtle way. You're the foreman, she asked one afternoon, watching him work a young horse in the corral. The horse was nervous, skittish, fighting the rope, and Caleb was moving around it with a patience that looked almost like stillness. Yes, ma'am. You're young for a foreman. I'm good at what I do. She smiled. I don't doubt it. She brought him lunch in the fields twice that first week. She laughed at things he said that weren't particularly funny. She asked him questions about his work and listened to the answers with an attention that most people reserve for important things. Morrison pulled Caleb aside one evening, his voice low and deliberate. Margaret likes you. She's a good woman. Comes from a good family. A pause. You could do worse, Walker. Yes, sir. But Caleb hesitated. There was no easy way to say this. I'm not interested. Morrison stared at him. You seeing someone else? No, sir. Then what's the problem? He stopped. Tried again. I'm waiting for someone. Someone you haven't met yet. Yes, sir. Morrison looked at him for a long moment. That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. Yes, sir, probably is. Margaret left at the end of August. She didn't say goodbye to Caleb, and he didn't blame her. That night he wrote, Dear Eliza, a woman was interested in me this summer. She was kind and pretty and available, and any sensible man would have pursued her. I didn't, because even though I've never met you, even though you've never written back, even though I don't know if you're real or married or gone entirely, I can't imagine loving anyone else. Does that make me crazy? Probably, but I'd rather be crazy and faithful than sane and settled. I hope you understand. Somehow I think you do. Forever yours, Caleb. The 7th year began like all the others, winter, spring, summer, fall. Work and sleep and letters. But there was something different about it that Caleb couldn't name. A restlessness, a sense that something was ending or beginning, or both. He turned 25 in February. The new hands thought he was 35. Hard-living aged a man. In early March, on a Sunday night, he sat at his small wooden table and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. His hand hovered over it for a long time. Over 300 letters, over 300 unanswered prayers sent into the void. This is the last one, he said out loud to the empty room. He meant it. Dear Eliza, this is my last letter to you. Not because I'm angry, not because I've given up believing you exist, but because I think 7 years is long enough to love someone from a distance. I'm going to keep living, keep working. Maybe someday I'll meet someone, and build a life that doesn't include letters to a woman who never writes back. That would be all right. I've decided that would be all right. But I want you to know something before I stop. These 7 years weren't wasted. They taught me that love doesn't require reciprocation to be real. That hope doesn't need an answer to matter. That sometimes the act of reaching out even into silence is enough. You've been my companion through every hard winter and every lonely night. You've been the reason I tried to be a better man than I might have been otherwise. Thank you for that. I hope your life is everything you dreamed it would be. Goodbye, Eliza. With all the love I have, Caleb Walker. He sealed it. Rode to town the next morning and stood in front of the post office for 10 full minutes before finally walking in and mailing it. Rode back to the ranch feeling hollow in a way he'd never felt before, not like grief exactly, more like the silence after a very long storm. That was March 8th, 1892. On March 22nd, Caleb was out mending fence on the north pasture when Morrison's son rode up fast, his horse blowing steam in the cold air. Mail for you, Walker. Caleb took the envelope without looking at it. Probably a seed circular, maybe a letter from his sister in Missouri, who wrote him twice a year with cheerful updates he rarely answered. He shoved it in his jacket and kept working. It wasn't until that evening, back in his cabin, fire going, the day's exhaustion settled into his bones, that he pulled it out. His heart stopped. The handwriting was unfamiliar, delicate, careful in a way that suggested someone who had learned penmanship as a discipline, not an accident. The return address said Boston, Massachusetts. His hands started shaking. He sat down on the edge of his bed and stared at the envelope for 5 full minutes. His mouth had gone dry. His chest was doing something that wasn't quite breathing. Finally, he made himself open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, 4 words at the top in that same careful script. I am still here. And beneath that, in his same hand, I have read every letter, every single one. I will explain everything. I am coming in September. Forgive me. Eliza. The letter fell from his hand. He stood up, sat down, stood up again. 7 years. She had been reading them, all of them, every single one, and she had never answered. She was real. She was coming. In September. He walked outside into the cold March night without his jacket and pressed his forehead against the fence post. And for the first time since the afternoon they'd buried his mother 15 years ago, Caleb Walker broke down and cried. Morrison found him an hour later still at the fence, the letter crushed in his fist like a lifeline. Walker. Morrison's voice was careful in the way of a man approaching something unpredictable. You all right? Caleb couldn't speak. He held up the letter. Morrison took it, read it once. His weathered face showed nothing. He folded it carefully and handed it back. Well, he said finally, guess you weren't crazy after all. Caleb's voice came out strange when he finally found it rough and cracked around the edges, like wood that had been warped by weather. She's coming in September. That's 6 months away. I know. What are you going to do? Caleb looked at the cabin, at the land stretching out around them in every direction, vast and dark and indifferent and beautiful. At the shelf inside where 300 letters sat in a row. I don't know, he admitted. Morrison clapped him on the shoulder once hard, the way men did when they didn't know what else to offer. Figure it out, son, and figure it out fast. That night, Caleb sat at his table for 2 hours with a pen and a blank sheet of paper trying to write back to her. He started 17 different letters, crossed out every single one. What did you say to a woman who already knew everything about you? Finally, just before midnight, he wrote 4 lines. Eliza, I don't know what to say except thank you, and I'm terrified. And I'll be waiting. Caleb. He posted it the next morning with hands that still hadn't stopped shaking. The ranch hands noticed the change in him immediately. Walker's been smiling, one of them said at breakfast, with the tone of a man reporting something deeply suspicious. It's unnatural, said another. Maybe he's sick, offered a third. Tommy, the youngest hand, barely 17, 3 months on the ranch, was the only one with the nerve to ask directly. He appeared at Caleb's elbow while Caleb was checking the morning supply inventory and said without preamble, You seem different, boss. Something happened. Caleb looked at him over the top of the ledger. She wrote back. The room went silent in a way that rooms rarely go completely instantly, as if someone had pressed a hand over its mouth. The woman you've been writing to. Tommy's eyes were the size of plates. For 7 years. For 7 years. She's real. She's real. Caleb turned back to the ledger. And she's coming September. One of the older hands let out a low, long whistle that said more than words could. Tommy recovered first. So what are you going to do, boss? Caleb set down the ledger. He had been asking himself the same question for 3 days straight, and the answer had been getting clearer every hour, forming itself the way a fence line forms in fog gradually and then all at once. I'm going to make this place worthy of her, he said. They thought he was joking. He wasn't. The next morning, he rode into Cheyenne and withdrew every dollar he had saved in 7 years. $342, his entire life's accumulation, everything he had managed to set aside, out of a foreman's wages after room and board, and the cost of stamps. He spent it in one afternoon. Lumber, paint, glass for the broken windows, seeds for a garden he had never bothered to plant. Books, actual books, a whole box of them, history and literature and poetry, things he could barely read himself but thought a school teacher from Boston might want to see on a shelf. A rocking chair, fabric for curtains, a mirror, a table that didn't wobble when you set something on it. The general store owner, a taciturn man named Beaumont, who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing for 30 years, watched Caleb load the wagon with an expression of genuine bewilderment. Building a house walker, or making one fit for company. Most important company I'll ever have, Caleb said. He drove the wagon back to the ranch and started working. Every spare hour between his foreman duties went into the cabin. He replaced the broken windows first, then the rotting floorboards. He painted the walls white clean like something new. He hung the curtains. He built shelves for the books, measuring twice, and still getting it wrong twice before he got it right. He burned his hand on the stove, learning to cook something besides beans and salt pork, tried 3 times to bake bread, before producing something that didn't resemble a brick. Morrison watched all of this from a respectful distance for 2 weeks before finally saying something. He found Caleb replacing the cabin's window frames on a Sunday afternoon, his one day off, and stood at the edge of the work with his arms folded. She might not stay, Morrison said, quietly. No judgment in it. Caleb's hammer paused mid-swing. I know. She's from Boston. This is Wyoming. Most women can't handle the isolation. Most women aren't Eliza. You don't know her walker. You know her letters. That's not the same thing. Caleb set the hammer down and turned to face his boss directly. You're right. I don't know if she snores. I don't know if she's patient, or if she can cook, or if she'll hate it here after the first winter. But I know she's brave enough to write back after 7 years of silence. I know she's honest enough to say she needs to explain why she didn't. And I know she's willing to travel 2,000 miles to meet a man she's never seen. A pause. That's enough for me to try. Morrison looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has run out of arguments that aren't just fear. What do you need? He asked. Time. I need to finish this before September. You've got it. April bled into May. Caleb worked like a man who had been given a deadline and intended to meet it. The cabin transformed around him, the front porch with its new railing, the clean windows, the curtains with small blue flowers that he'd had to ride to 3 different stores to find, because Eliza had mentioned in her 3rd letter that she liked blue flowers in window curtains, and he had never forgotten it. He cleared the land around the cabin and planted cottonwood saplings along the dry creek bed that ran 40 yards to the south. They wouldn't be trees for years. For a long time, they'd be nothing but sticks in the ground. But someday they would be trees and they would provide shade, and Eliza would be able to sit on that porch in the summer and look at them and know that someone had planted them for her before she'd even arrived. Tommy found him one evening attempting to make stew standing over the wood stove with an expression of intense concentration and a pot that was producing deeply alarming smells. Boss, that smells terrible. I know. What are you making? Something edible, hopefully. Want help? Caleb stepped back from the stove. You know how to cook. My ma taught me. Figured it was useful. Tommy picked up the spoon and inspected the contents of the pot with the skeptical eye of someone who knew what actual food was supposed to look like. This is beyond saving. Start over. Start over. They dumped it and started again. By midnight, they had made something that tasted almost like food. Caleb ate 2 bowls of it standing up and felt for the first time in months like he might actually be capable of not completely humiliating himself when Eliza arrived. Why do you care about cooking? Tommy asked, watching him. She's a woman. She'll cook. Caleb looked at him with something that wasn't quite a smile. She's a teacher, Tommy. She's got better things to do than fix my meals just because she's a woman. Tommy blinked, thought about it. That's actually pretty smart. Tell that to the stew. May became June. Eliza's letters started arriving more frequently, short, careful ones at first, then longer, more open. She told him about the poverty she had hidden from him all these years. About her father's illness, which had consumed the last 4 years of her life. About the shame that had kept her silent when she should have written back the bone-deep shame of having nothing to offer someone who had given her everything through words alone. I was afraid, she wrote. Afraid you had imagined something better than what I am. Afraid that answering would only lead to you discovering how ordinary I turned out to be. It was cowardice, I know that. I have no defense. Caleb wrote back immediately. Stop apologizing. You survived. You did what you had to do. I understand duty better than most people understand breathing. You don't owe me explanations. You don't owe me anything. But I'm grateful you're coming anyway. Her next letter arrived in early July. Caleb, I need you to know something before I arrive. I am not who you might have imagined. I am 30 years old. I have been poor my entire life. I own 3 dresses, and they are all worn at the hems. I am plain. I am practical. I do not expect romance or poetry when we meet. I only ask for honesty. Can you give me that? He wrote back the same day. Eliza, I am 25. I own 1 good shirt. I can barely read. I am rough around every edge and always will be. I don't know how to dance or speak properly or be anything other than what I am, a cowboy who has loved you for 7 years through nothing but words on paper. When you step off that train, I will be honest about everything, including the fact that I am absolutely terrified you'll take one look at me and realize you made a terrible mistake. Her response came 3 weeks later, and it was 4 words that undid him completely. Then we'll be terrified together. I arrived September 14th, the 2 o'clock train. Caleb read that letter 50 times. He memorized every word. He slept with it, folded under his pillow. August came with heat that shimmered off the plains in waves. The work intensified, and late summer was always brutal, the land demanding everything before it closed itself off for winter. Caleb drove himself harder than he had ever driven himself, trying to outrun the growing panic in his chest. What if she hated it here? What if she stepped off that train, took one look at the vast emptiness of Wyoming, and understood for the first time what she had actually agreed to? What if she looked at him and saw nothing worth 2,000 miles of travel? Morrison found him at midnight, painting the porch railing by lamplight, moving with the focused urgency of a man who believed that if he stopped working, he might lose his nerve entirely. Walker, it's dark. I can see well enough. You're going to work yourself to death before she gets here. I need it to be perfect. It won't be. Nothing is. Morrison's voice was even matter-of-fact. And if she's the woman you think she is, she won't care. Caleb set down the brush. He looked at his hands, rough and calloused and stained with paint, now on top of everything else. What if I'm not enough? Morrison was quiet for a moment. You've been enough for 7 years of letters. You'll be enough when she gets here. A pause. Now go to sleep before you collapse. Caleb slept 4 hours and woke before dawn to start again. September arrived like a verdict. He bought a new shirt, got his hair cut by the barber in Cheyenne who didn't ask questions, tried to scrub 7 years of ranch work out of his hands and failed. The calluses were permanent, the scars were permanent, the leather texture of his skin was as permanent as the land itself. He was what he was. He could only hope it was enough. On September 13th, the night before Eliza was due to arrive, Caleb couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch in the rocking chair he had bought for her and watched the stars wheel overhead and tried to be still. Tommy came out and sat beside him without being asked. You ready, boss? No. You scared? Terrified. Tommy was quiet for a moment. What's the worst that could happen? Caleb thought about it honestly. She leaves, goes back to Boston. I spend the rest of my life knowing I had one chance and wasn't enough to make her stay. And the best? He looked at the sky. She stays. We build something real. I get to know the woman behind the letters, and she gets to know me beyond the words I wrote. A pause. We become real to each other. That sounds pretty good. It sounds impossible. Tommy turned to look at him. Boss, you wrote letters for 7 years to a woman who never answered. You've already done the impossible. Tomorrow's just the next step. Caleb looked at the young man beside him. This kid, barely 17, who had arrived 3 months ago from nowhere and somehow become something like a friend. When did you get so wise? Tommy grinned. I listen to you talk in your sleep. You say some pretty smart things when you're not trying. They sat in silence after that, watching the last of the stars fade into the pale approach of dawn. Finally, Tommy stood up and stretched. Get some sleep, boss. Tomorrow changes everything. Caleb tried. He went inside and lay down on the bed he had built for 2 people who hadn't yet met and stared at the ceiling. At some point near dawn, exhaustion finally claimed him. He woke to someone shaking his shoulder. Morrison stood over him. It's noon, Walker. Train comes in 2 hours. Caleb shot out of bed as if he'd been struck by lightning. He washed, shaved, put on the new shirt, and immediately spilled coffee on it. Changed into his second clean shirt. tried to tame his hair, and failed. At 1:30, he rode into Cheyenne and tied his horse outside the train station and went inside to wait. The platform was busy with the ordinary traffic of an ordinary afternoon. Men in business suits, women with children, a group of miners heading north, an elderly couple navigating the crowd with the careful efficiency of people who had been doing things together for decades. Caleb stood with his hat in his hands and saw none of them. The clock tower showed 1:45, then 1:50. In the distance, a train whistle blew. Caleb's hands tightened on the brim of his hat until his knuckles went white. The train came in at exactly 2 o'clock, right on schedule, steam hissing brakes, shrieking the whole platform filling with noise and motion in the organized chaos of arrival. Passengers began to step down. Men, women, families, strangers. Caleb searched every face. Then he saw her. She stood on the bottom step of the passenger car, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding a small traveling bag against her hip. She was exactly as she had described herself, plain dress worn at the hem, hair pulled back simply. 30 years old and showing the particular kind of tired that came from 6 days on a train and years of hard living before that. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. Their eyes met across the platform. 7 years of words, 7 years of ink and paper and distance and silence. And now 15 feet of open air between them and two people who knew everything and nothing about each other, learning for the first time what the other one looked like. Eliza stepped down onto the platform. Her legs weren't quite steady. She had crossed 2,000 miles to get here, and now that she had arrived, her body seemed to be reassessing the decision. Caleb moved toward her. His boots felt like they were full of concrete. He stopped 3 feet away. Caleb. Her voice was softer than he had imagined, careful like she was testing the sound of his name in her mouth. Eliza. His voice cracked on her name like a branch under ice. "I," she started. "I," he said at the same moment. They both stopped. Both tried to smile. Both failed. And then Caleb did something he hadn't planned and had never done with any woman in his life. He closed the last 3 feet between them, let go of his hat, and pulled her into his arms. Not with romance, not with grace, but with the desperate force of a man who had been drowning for 7 years and had finally found something solid to hold on to. Eliza went rigid for half a second. Then her traveling bag hit the platform with a thud, and her arms came up around his shoulders, and she held him back just as hard. "I'm here," she whispered against his shoulder. Her voice was shaking. "I'm really here." Caleb meant to say something, meant to be steady and measured and everything a man was supposed to be. Instead, his shoulders started shaking, and the tears came without permission. 7 years of loneliness releasing at once, 7 years of hoping against reason, 7 years of writing into silence, and never knowing if any of it had mattered. He cried into her shoulder while strangers walked past and stared. Cried in a way he hadn't since he was 12 years old. Cried like the boy he'd been before life had made him hard, and work had made him careful, and years of solitude had taught him not to want too much. Eliza didn't pull away, didn't tell him to stop or seem embarrassed or shocked. She just held him tighter, her own breath unsteady, her own eyes wet. "I know," she whispered. "I know, me too." When he finally pulled back, his face was wet and his eyes were red, and he had never in his life felt so humiliated and so relieved at the same time. "I'm sorry," he managed. "I didn't mean to." "Don't." She reached up and pressed her thumb against his cheek. Her own tears had started falling without ceremony. "Don't you dare apologize for being human." He bent down and picked up his hat, picked up her bag, tried to collect himself into something that resembled a functional man. "I have a wagon," he said, "to take you to the ranch. Unless you need to rest first, there's a hotel in town if—" "Take me home," she said. Home. She had called it home. She had been on Wyoming soil for 4 minutes, and she had already called it home. Something loosened in Caleb's chest that had been tight for 7 years. "Yes, mammy," he said. He led her to the wagon and helped her up onto the seat, climbed up beside her. They rode out of Cheyenne into the open country, the late afternoon light turning the plains gold around them, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had said everything that mattered across 300 letters and were now simply learning how to exist beside each other. After 20 minutes, Eliza spoke. "I'm afraid to talk to you." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "Why?" "Because in the letter I knew what to say. I had time to think, to make the words come out right." She looked down at her hands folded in her lap. "But now I don't know how to be the woman you've been writing to." "You don't have to be anyone except who you are. What if who I am disappoints you?" Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop. turned to face her directly. This woman he had loved for 7 years in theory and was beginning to love in fact with her plain dress and her exhausted eyes and the courage it had taken to board a train into the unknown. Eliza, you got on a train and traveled 2,000 miles to meet a man you'd never seen based on nothing but letters. You're already braver than I am. Nothing you do from here on out could possibly disappoint me. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then quietly, you say that now. I'll say it tomorrow, too, and the day after that. She met his eyes fully for the first time since they'd left the station. And something in her face shifted the careful guardedness, easing just slightly like a door that has been locked for a very long time, beginning to consider opening. I can't cook very well, she said. Neither can I. We'll learn together. We'll learn together. She almost smiled. I talk too much when I'm nervous. Good, I don't talk enough. I'm scared of horses. That surprised him. You're on a cattle ranch. I know. A small nervous laugh. I didn't think that part through very well. Caleb smiled, a real one, the first one in longer than he could remember, that actually reached all the way to his eyes. We'll figure it out. He clicked to the horses and they started moving again. The ranch came into view as the sun began its long descent toward the western mountains. The cabin with its new white paint catching the last of the light, the porch railing straight and clean, the curtains visible through the glass windows, the cottonwood saplings standing in their neat row beside the creek bed like small promises. Eliza sat up straighter. Her hands found the edge of the wagon seat. Is that it? She asked. Yes, ma'am. She didn't speak. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye, watched her take it in the smallness of it, the isolation, the vast and indifferent land stretching away in every direction. His stomach tightened. Too small, too rough, too far from everything she had known. He stopped the wagon in front of the cabin and climbed down and came around to help her. Eliza stepped down onto the ground and stood still for a moment, looking at everything, the porch, the rocking chair, the curtains with their small blue flowers. Her hand came up slowly and touched the porch railing. She moved along it to the rocking chair and ran her fingers over the armrest. Then she turned and Caleb saw that she was crying silently, without drama tears simply running down her face. It's perfect, she said. Her voice barely made it above a whisper. It's the most perfect thing I've ever seen. Something tight in Caleb's chest released so completely and so suddenly that he had to remind himself to breathe. Would you like to see inside? He managed. She nodded, unable to speak. He opened the door and stepped back to let her enter first. Eliza walked into the cabin and stopped. Her hand went to her mouth. The books on their carefully built shelves. The curtains with the blue flowers she had mentioned in her third letter 3 years ago. The table that didn't wobble. The kitchen area where he had burned himself twice learning to cook. Everything clean, everything ready, everything waiting. You remembered, she whispered. I remember every word you ever wrote. She turned to face him, tears still falling unhurried and steady. Caleb, I don't deserve this. Yes, he said, you do. You don't understand. I should have written back years ago. I was a coward. I let shame and pride keep me silent while you— Stop, his voice was gentle. We both did what we had to do to survive. You took care of your father. I took care of myself. Neither of us was wrong. We just weren't ready until now. How can you not be angry with me? Because anger requires blame, and I don't blame you for being human. Eliza sank into the chair at the table and put her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook. Caleb stood in the middle of the cabin he had built for her and watched her cry and felt completely helplessly at a loss for what to do. 7 years of letters had taught him how to comfort her with words. But words felt inadequate now, clumsy and small. He moved to the stove, put water on to boil, made tea the way she'd mentioned liking it in one of her early letters, weak with honey if there was any. There was. He set the cup in front of her. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Thank you, she said. You're welcome. They sat in the small cabin in the late afternoon light, and outside voices approached across the yard. The ranch hands were coming. Eliza looked up. They know about me. Everyone knows. I haven't exactly been subtle. What did you tell them? The truth, that I've been writing to you for 7 years and you finally wrote back. Her expression shifted into something uncertain. They must think I'm terrible. They think I'm the lucky one. A knock at the door interrupted them. Caleb opened it to find Morrison standing on the new porch with Tommy and 3 of the hands, all of them holding their hats and looking simultaneously eager and mortified to be there. Figured we'd come say hello, Morrison said, if that's all right. Caleb looked at Eliza. She nodded and straightened in her chair, pulling herself together with the quiet determination of a woman who had been doing hard things her entire life. The men filed in, filling the small space with the particular discomfort of rough men attempting to be gentle. They stood in a row, hats pressed to their chests, and looked at this woman who had come 2,000 miles to answer a cowboy's letters. "Ma'am," Morrison said, "I'm Henry Morrison. I run this place. These are Tommy, Jack, Pete, and Samuel. We're glad you're here." "Thank you," Eliza said quietly. "It's kind of you to welcome me." Tommy stepped forward, his young face stripped of everything except honesty. "Miss Bennett, I just want to say the boss, Caleb, he's been working himself half to death getting this place ready for you. If you decide to stay, you should know." He stopped, composed himself. "You're getting the best man in Wyoming." Caleb's face went red. "Tommy, it's true, boss. Everyone here knows it." Eliza looked at Caleb, looked at the men standing in a row with their hats in their hands, looked at the cabin with its blue flower curtains and its careful shelves and its table that didn't wobble. "Then I'm very fortunate," she said softly. After the men left, the cabin was quiet again. Outside, the last of the day's light faded from the sky. Eliza sat with her hands around the teacup. Caleb sat across from her. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said. "I know. The Morrisons have a spare room in the main house. You can stay there until—" He stopped. "Until we figure things out." "Until we get married, you mean?" The words settled between them like something solid. "I won't pressure you," Caleb said carefully. "I know we just met. I know this is all strange and new and—" "How much time?" she interrupted. He blinked. "What? How much time do we need, Caleb?" She leaned forward slightly. "We've known each other for 7 years. We've shared more in letters than most married couples share in a lifetime. What exactly are we waiting to figure out? Whether you can stand me in person." Eliza set down her teacup. She reached across the table and took his scarred, calloused hand in both of hers. "I already know I can stand you," she said. "The question is whether you can stand me when you realize I'm not the perfect woman you've been imagining." "I never imagined you as perfect." "Then what did you imagine?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Really thought about it. "Someone real," he said finally. "Someone honest. Someone brave enough to keep living even when life was hard. Someone who understood loneliness but didn't let it make her bitter." He met her eyes. "Someone exactly like you." Eliza's breath caught. "Ask me," she said. "Ask you what?" "What you've wanted to ask since the day you wrote that first letter." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head, and every version had felt wrong. And now the moment was here, and every version still felt wrong, except the real one. He stood, moved around the table, knelt beside her chair, not because it was graceful or planned, but because it felt right, and that was enough. "Eliza Bennett," he said, "I have loved you for 7 years through nothing but ink and paper. I don't know if I can make you happy. I don't know if this life will be enough for you, but I promise I will try every single day to be worthy of the faith you showed by getting on that train." He looked up at her. "Will you marry me?" Eliza looked down at him with shaking fingers and touched his face. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, as if she wanted the walls to hear it. "Yes, Caleb, yes." He stood and pulled her up with him, and they held each other in the middle of that small cabin while the stars came out one by one in the Wyoming sky. Two people who had loved each other for 7 years in theory and were only just beginning to discover what it meant in fact. When he asked, his voice quiet against her hair. "As soon as possible," she said. "I didn't come 2,000 miles to wait." And outside, the cottonwood saplings stood in their row by the dry creek bed, small and thin and certain, already reaching toward a future that neither of them could fully see, but both of them were willing to build. The morning after Eliza arrived, they were married on the porch she had touched with wondering hands the evening before. It happened the way most important things happen in Wyoming, practically without much ceremony, because the alternative was waiting, and waiting required more patience than either of them had left. The circuit preacher was a tired-looking man in his 60s named Reverend Cole, who had come through Morrison's ranch every third Friday for the past decade and had married enough couples and buried enough of the same to have developed a philosopher's perspective on the general unreliability of human planning. He looked at them both with the unhurried assessment of a man who had seen every variety of rushed decision and learned to distinguish the reckless from the certain. "You're sure?" he asked, not unkindly. "We're sure," they said together. He almost smiled. "Right then." The ceremony took place on the porch in the late morning, with the Wyoming sky open and enormous overhead, and the smell of fall coming in on the wind. The ranch hands stood in a loose row as witnesses, Tommy with his hat pressed flat against his chest, Jack and Pete and Samuel trying to look dignified with varying degrees of success. Mrs. Morrison, Henry's wife, stood off to one side with a handkerchief already deployed, crying with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had decided tears were appropriate and saw no reason to be apologetic about them. Caleb stood in his one good shirt, the one without coffee stains, and looked at the woman beside him. He had spent 7 years imagining this moment in every possible form, and not one of his imaginings had looked like this ordinary and terrifying and more real than anything he had ever experienced. "Do you, Caleb Walker, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." No hesitation, no trembling voice. Just the simple truth said plainly. "Do you, Eliza Bennett, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eliza's voice came out clear and level, the voice of a woman who had made up her mind and was done being afraid of it. "I do? Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Their first kiss was awkward and brief and wonderful. Two people discovering that after 7 years of knowing each other completely through words, they were nonetheless utter strangers in every other way, and that this was somehow the most exciting thing in the world. The hands cheered. Mrs. Morrison cried harder. Morrison shook Caleb's hand with the solemn gravity of a man transferring a sacred responsibility. "Congratulations, Walker," he said. "Now comes the hard part." He was not wrong. That first night was agony. Not because of what happened between them, but because of everything that hadn't been figured out yet, all the ordinary practical details of two people who have known each other's souls and now have to learn each other's habits. They sat in the cabin after the celebration, which had consisted of Mrs. Morrison's cake and a bottle of Morrison's whiskey passed among the hands, and the silence had a different quality to it than any silence they'd shared before. This was the silence of two people who were now responsible for each other and didn't quite know what to do with that yet. "I can sleep on the floor," Caleb offered. Eliza looked at him. "Don't be ridiculous. We're married." "I know, but you've had a long journey and I didn't want to assume—" "Caleb!" Her voice was patient, almost amused. "I'm 30 years old. I'm not a blushing girl who doesn't understand what marriage means. I'm just—" She twisted her hands in her lap. "Nervous." "So am I." She stared at him. "You are—" "Terrified." He said it without embarrassment because 7 years of letter writing had stripped most of his capacity for pretending out of him. "I've spent 7 years telling you everything about myself on paper, and now you're actually here, and I have no idea what I'm doing." Something about that admission broke something open between them. Eliza laughed high and nervous, the kind of laugh that wasn't quite amused and wasn't quite not amused, and then Caleb laughed too. And they sat in that small cabin and laughed together for the first time at the sheer impossibility of the situation they had put themselves in. "This is ridiculous," Eliza managed, pressing her hand over her mouth. "We know everything about each other and nothing at all." "Then let's start with something simple," Caleb said. "Tell me one thing I don't know from the letters." She thought about it. "I snore, not loudly, but I do. I grind my teeth when I'm stressed. I hate the smell of tobacco." A pause. "I hate the cold, but I seem to have moved to Wyoming, so that's working out well." Caleb nodded gravely. "I talk in my sleep, according to Tommy. I can't fall asleep unless the room is completely dark. I was once kicked by a horse and pretended it didn't hurt for 2 weeks before it turned out I'd broken a rib." "You broke a rib and didn't tell anyone." "Didn't want the fuss." She looked at him with an expression caught exactly between exasperation and tenderness. "Caleb Walker, you are going to be the most infuriating man to be married to." "Probably," he agreed, "but at least I'll be honest about it." They kept going, trading small truths back and forth like cards, until the nervousness faded into something easier. Not comfort exactly, not yet, but its first approximation. When they finally went to bed, they lay beside each other in the dark with the careful distance of two people learning a new language, and Eliza reached out in the quiet and found his hand and held on, and that was enough. For the first time in 7 years, Caleb Walker fell asleep knowing he wasn't alone. The first real fight happened 3 weeks in. Looking back, Caleb would understand it as inevitable. Two people who had known each other through the carefully chosen medium of letters suddenly confronted with the raw, unedited reality of each other. In the letters, they had both been their best selves, or at least their most thoughtful selves. In the cabin, there was no time to choose the right words. There was only the day's exhaustion and the morning's tension, and the steady accumulation of things left unsaid. It started on a Tuesday in October. Caleb came home after dark after 14 hours of moving cattle to winter pasture, 14 hours of cold and hard labor, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that turned everything gray and found the cabin cold. No fire in the stove, no supper ready. Eliza sat at the table staring at a piece of paper, tears streaming down her face without apparent effort, as if her body had simply run out of reasons to stop them. "What's wrong?" The alarm in his voice made her flinch. "Nothing." "Eliza, I said nothing." Her voice was sharp in a way he hadn't heard before. Not cruel, but frayed. "I'm fine." He set down his hat slowly. "Did something happen? Why would anything happen? I just sat here all day, in this cabin, with nothing to do and no one to talk to, while you were gone for," she gestured vaguely, 14 hours. "I was working." "I know you were working. I'm not stupid, Caleb. I know what ranch life is." She stopped. Her hands crumpled the piece of paper into a fist. "I just thought I would have more to do. I thought I'd be useful. I thought I'd teach, start the school you wrote about in your letters. But Mrs. Morrison told me today there aren't enough children within riding distance to justify it. So what exactly am I supposed to do here?" The words hit him like a physical blow. The honest answer, "Be my wife. Make our home exist beside me," formed in his head, and he had enough sense not to say it. He could hear how it would land. He could hear what it would mean to a woman who had spent her entire adult life doing something that mattered. "You're supposed to—" He stopped. "I be your wife, make your meals, mend your clothes." Her voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than anger. "Is that it? Because, I didn't come 2,000 miles to be a housekeeper, Caleb. I came because you wrote about building something together. A ranch with a schoolhouse. Children who deserved more than dust. Remember?" "I remember." "Then where is it? Where's the dream you sold me on?" Caleb's exhaustion tipped over into something that felt uncomfortably like defensiveness. "You've been here 3 weeks. You expected me to build a schoolhouse in 3 weeks. I expected you to at least have a plan, to have thought about what I would do here when I arrived. I've been trying to keep us fed and warm and alive. I'm sorry if that's not enough for you." The silence that followed was brutal and complete. Eliza stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor like an accusation. "I'm going to bed," she said, and walked past him without another word. The bedroom door closed with a quiet click that felt louder than anything she could have slammed. Caleb stood in the cold cabin and wanted to punch the wall. Instead, he built a fire in the stove because they still needed warmth, and the needs of a household didn't pause for marital conflict, and sat at the table until midnight, staring at the grain of the wood and trying to understand what had just happened. He had built this place for her. He had spent his entire savings making it ready. He had tried to cook. He had planted those saplings along the creek bed that would take years to grow into anything. He had done everything he could think of, but he had not thought about what she would do when she was here. Not really. He had thought about having her, hear her presence, her voice, the end of the loneliness, but not about what she would need to be whole. The next morning she was up before him. Breakfast made speaking to him in the polite and distant tones of a woman who had decided that courtesy was preferable to honesty for the time being. He hated it worse than the fight. "I'm riding out to check the north fence," he said. "Be back by dark." "All right, have a good day, Caleb." He left feeling like he'd lost something he couldn't name. That evening he came home to an empty cabin and a note on the table. Went to the Morrison house. Back before supper. She returned 2 hours later carrying books. A whole stack of them pulled from somewhere in the Morrison household. "I'm going to teach," she announced, setting them down on the table with the decisive confidence of someone who has found the solution to a problem and is not going to let anyone take it from her. The Morrison's daughter is 7 years old and has had no formal schooling. Tommy can barely read beyond his own name. Jack has never been to school a day in his life. She counted them off on her fingers. "That's 3 students. It's a start." Caleb stared at her. "You asked Mrs. Morrison for her books." "I did. And she just gave them to you. She said any woman brave enough to marry you deserves whatever help she can get." Despite the residue of last night still between them, Caleb almost smiled. "Where are you going to teach?" "Here, in the cabin, 3 afternoons a week." She looked at him with a directness that made it clear this was not a negotiation. "Unless you object." It was not really a question. The set of her jaw told him she was doing this whether he agreed or not. "I don't object," he said. "Good." She started arranging the books on the shelf. Caleb watched her, this woman he had married, who had gone from crying over uselessness to creating purpose in the span of one afternoon, with nothing but her own will and 2 hours and a stack of borrowed books. "I'm sorry," he said. She paused but didn't turn around. "For what?" "For not having a plan, for not thinking about what you'd need when you got here. For building you a cabin and a shelf and curtains and not thinking about the most important thing. She was quiet for a moment, then she turned. I'm sorry too, she said. I knew what I was signing up for. I just didn't know how hard it would be to actually live it. She sat down at the table and he sat across from her, and they looked at each other honestly for the first time since the fight. In the letters, I could be anyone, say anything, take as much time as I needed to be eloquent. But here, living with you every day, I can't hide behind carefully chosen words. You see me when I'm tired and frustrated and not at my best. And I'm terrified that eventually you'll realize you married someone ordinary. Eliza, his voice was steady. You traveled 2,000 miles alone to marry a stranger. There is nothing ordinary about you. You say that now. But what about in 5 years and when the novelty wears off and we're just two people who ran out of things to say to each other? Then we find new things, we build new dreams, we keep choosing each other even when it's hard. She looked at him with something fragile in her eyes. You always make it sound simple. Simple doesn't mean easy. The lessons began the following week. Little Sarah Morrison came first, shy and uncertain, holding her mother's hand until she'd been in the cabin for 10 minutes and decided that Miss Eliza was safe. Tommy showed up the next day with his hat in his hands and a look of profound embarrassment. The boss said I should learn to read proper, he mumbled. Did he? Eliza's eyes cut briefly to Caleb, who had suddenly become very interested in the ceiling. Yes, ma'am. Said it would help me get ahead. Jack came the day after, then Samuel. By the end of the month, Eliza had 5 students crowded into the cabin, 3 afternoons a week, bent over borrowed slates. Their faces concentrated with the particular intensity of people learning something for the first time. Caleb would come home in the evenings to find them still there. Sometimes Tommy, with his tongue between his teeth, sounding out words syllable by syllable. Sarah copying her letters with the careful pride of a child discovering her own competence. Jack, who was 32 years old and had never learned to read, holding a primer, with shaking hands and the expression of a man terrified and determined in equal measure. How'd it go today? Caleb would ask. Sarah can read simple sentences now. Eliza's voice, when she talked about her students, had a quality he had never heard before, a particular brightness. A warmth that was different from her warmth with him, more public, somehow directed outward at the world. Tommy knows his multiplication tables up to 5. Jack wrote his full name for the first time. The pride in her voice made something warm spread through Caleb's chest. You're good at this. I love it, she said simply. I forgot how much I loved it. October bled into November. The first snow came early and stayed late. Life in the cabin settled into a rhythm, work meals, lessons, sleep. It was not the romance Caleb had imagined during those 7 years of letter writing. It was harder and more ordinary, and more real than anything he had imagined, and it was better for being all of those things. They learned each other's rhythms. Eliza learned that Caleb needed silence in the mornings, that he moved through the first hour of the day in a kind of focused quiet, doing things in their particular order, and that speaking to him before he had had his coffee and done his first outside check was roughly equivalent to speaking to a rock. Caleb learned that Eliza processed her thoughts out loud, that when she was working through something, she needed to say it, and he didn't need to respond or solve anything. He just needed to be present and not interrupt. They learned each other's bodies too. Awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence, those intimate moments became a language of their own, the one space where words weren't necessary, where 7 years of carefully constructed sentences gave way to something simpler and more direct. But the isolation wore on Eliza in ways that Caleb could see even when she tried to hide them. He would catch her standing at the window on winter afternoons, looking out at the endless white landscape with an expression he couldn't quite read, not grief, not regret, but something in that neighborhood. The way she sometimes asked him the same 3 questions about his day that she'd asked the day before because there was nothing new in her world to substitute for them. One night in December, lying in the dark, listening to the wind scour the walls, he said, "Tell me about Boston." "Why?" "Because you miss it. I can see it." She was quiet for a moment. He waited. "I miss the noise," she said finally. "The people walking down the street and hearing 10 different conversations at once. The smell of bread from the bakery on Tremont Street. The church bells on Sunday morning. Feeling like I was part of something larger than myself." A pause. "I don't regret coming. I want you to know that. But I'd be lying if I said I don't miss it." Caleb stared at the ceiling. "What if we went to town more often, once a week instead of once a month? You could meet the other women in Cheyenne, make some friends. The nearest woman is Mrs. Morrison, and she's 6 miles away. So we ride 6 miles. In winter, Caleb, be reasonable. I'm trying to help. I know you are. She rolled toward him in the dark, and he felt her hand find his. I just need to figure out how to be happy here on my own without needing you to fix it. That's my job, not yours. He held her hand in the dark and didn't say anything because sometimes there was nothing to say. December arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days. They were trapped inside supplies, running low with nothing to do except exist in the same small space. By the second day, the cabin had shrunk to roughly the size of a coffin, and they were snapping at each other over nothing. Must you tap your foot like that? Must you sigh every 5 minutes? I'm not sighing. You've sighed 11 times in the last hour. You're counting my sighs. There's nothing else to do. On the third day, Caleb went out into the blizzard to check on the horses, because anything was better than one more hour in that cabin. Eliza shouted after him that he'd freeze to death. Better than suffocating in here, he called back. He came home an hour later, half frozen, to find her crying at the table. The real kind of crying, not the quiet, strategic kind, but the ugly, abandoned kind that meant something had finally broken through. I hate this, she sobbed. I hate fighting with you. I hate this cabin. I hate being cold and bored and useless. Caleb shook the snow from his coat and knelt beside her chair. You're not useless. You're teaching 5 people to read. That matters. It's not enough. It's not the school you wrote about. It's not, I know, it's not what I promised, but Eliza, he took her hands. We've been married 3 months. Give it time. How much time? As much as it takes. She looked at him with eyes swollen from crying. What if I can't do this? What if I'm not strong enough for this life? You are. I know you are. How do you know? Because you've already survived worse. You told me about your father, about the poverty, about nights you went hungry so he could eat. This is hard, but you've done hard before. You survived all of it. You'll survive this too. Eliza wiped her eyes with shaking hands. I'm sorry, you don't deserve this. Stop. He took her face in his hands gently, the way you hold something that matters. You're allowed to struggle. You're allowed to miss your old life. You're allowed to be human. He held her gaze. But don't apologize for it. Not to me. Not ever. The blizzard ended. Life continued. Christmas came and went with quiet celebration. Eliza made a cake that collapsed in the middle, and they ate it anyway. And Caleb gave her a shawl he had bought months ago in anticipation of this, and she gave him gloves. She had knitted herself, the stitching uneven in ways that made them more rather than less. They're crooked, she said. They're from you. That makes them perfect. January brought news that upended everything. Mrs. Morrison came to the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon with an expression that Eliza had come to recognize as the face of a woman carrying information she wasn't sure was welcome. My sister in Cheyenne just had a baby, she said after they'd sat down with tea. She's struggling. She needs help for a few months, and I'm going to her. A pause. I wanted to talk to you before I left. I'll miss the lessons, Eliza said. Sarah's been making such progress. That's not what I came to talk about. Mrs. Morrison looked at her directly the way she did when she had something important to say and intended to say it regardless of how it was received. Sarah can continue her lessons with you here, but there are other families in Cheyenne, Eliza. The Henderson family has 3 children. The Blacks have 2. If you moved to town, you could teach all of them, a real school. The silence in the cabin was complete. Move to Cheyenne, Eliza said. You'd have students, other women to talk to, a real community. But I'm married. I can't just... You could come back on weekends, or Caleb could come to you when his work allows. Plenty of ranch families live separately during the week. Mrs. Morrison folded her hands in her lap. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it might be what you need. After Mrs. Morrison left, Eliza sat very still in the chair by the window for a long time. Caleb found her like that when he came in from the afternoon's work. Her hands folded in her lap, her gaze unfocused, her tea cold in its cup. What happened? He asked. She told him, watched his face carefully as she laid it all out. Mrs. Morrison's suggestion, the families in Cheyenne, the possibility of a real school. When she finished, Caleb sat down heavily on the bench by the door. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the January wind was doing what it always did. What do you want to do? He asked. I don't know. Yes, you do. Her hands twisted in her lap. If I go, what does that say about our marriage? That I'd rather be in town teaching than here with you. It says you need purpose. There's no shame in that. Caleb, her voice cracked slightly. We've been married 4 months. 4 months. If I leave now, you're not leaving. You're teaching. There's a difference. Is there? Because it feels like I'm choosing between you and the life I need. The words hung between them like weather. Caleb stood up and walked to the window. stood looking out at the frozen land at the cottonwood saplings he'd planted in September. Bare now stripped by winter, looking exactly like what they were, sticks in the ground that required a great deal of faith. When I wrote those letters, he said finally, I wrote about building a school, about giving you a purpose, about partnership. He turned. I meant every word, but I was so focused on getting you here that I didn't think about what happens after, about what you'd actually need to be happy. He looked at her steadily. I am happy just having you here. But Eliza, you surviving isn't the same as you living. So what are you saying? I'm saying go to Cheyenne, teach, build your school. A pause. I'll visit when I can. We'll make it work. And if we can't, what if the distance breaks us? Then we were already broken and just didn't know it yet. The honesty of it stole her breath. She stared at him, this man who loved her so entirely that he was willing to send her away to keep her whole, and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have words for yet. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. You won't. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. But I'd rather have you living your purpose 50 miles away than dying slowly here just to stay near me. She started crying, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't ask for anything. He pulled her close and held her, and they stood in the middle of the cabin for a long time while the fire burned down. She left a week later, took her 3 dresses, Mrs. Morrison's books, and a promise that Caleb would come to Cheyenne every 2 weeks. The cabin felt empty in a way that was nothing like the emptiness he'd lived with for 7 years, that had been absence, a space where something had never been. This was lost, the specific cold shape of something removed. He worked longer hours to avoid being there. Ate standing up. Stopped making the bed because what was the point of making a bed for one person? Some mornings he would wake up and reach across to her side and remember and lie there in the dark for a while before getting up. Tommy found him one night sitting on the porch at midnight in temperatures that should have sent any sensible man inside. Boss, you'll freeze. Can't sleep. You miss her. Every second. Tommy sat down beside him without asking, wrapped in a blanket he'd had the foresight to bring. Then why'd you let her go? Caleb looked at the dark land stretching away under the winter stars. Because loving someone means wanting them to be whole, even if it costs you. Tommy was quiet, considering this. That sounds like something you'd write in a letter. Probably where I learned it. 2 weeks felt like 2 years. When Caleb finally rode into Cheyenne for his first visit, his heart hammering, with an anticipation that felt uncomfortably close to the feeling he'd had posting those first letters, he found Eliza in the common room of her boarding house, with 6 children arranged around her in a loose semicircle, their faces turned up to hers with the particular attentiveness that good teachers produce in their students. She looked up when he walked in. Her face transformed joy and relief and something that looked like guilt, all moving across it at once so quickly that a stranger might have missed them. Caleb, her voice came out softer than she'd intended. Eliza. The children stared at this rough cowboy who had materialized in the doorway of their lesson. Class dismissed for today, Eliza said. We'll continue tomorrow. They filed out with the reluctant slowness of children who know something interesting is happening and don't want to miss it. When the last one had gone, the room was suddenly very quiet. Caleb and Eliza stood on opposite sides of it like strangers who recognized each other. How are you? She asked. Miserable. Me too. Then why does this feel like the right thing? She crossed the room and put her arms around him, and he held her with the particular force of a man who had crossed 50 miles of winter prairie and was not letting go anytime soon. Because sometimes the right thing and the easy thing aren't the same, she said against his shoulder. They spent the night in her small boarding house room, holding each other with the careful tenderness of people who understood that the time was limited, and in the morning Caleb had to leave again. 2 more weeks, he said at the door. I know. I love you. It was the first time he had said it out loud in those specific words without the buffer of paper and ink. The directness of it stopped both of them. I love you too, she said, even though this is impossibly hard, especially because it's hard. He rode back to the ranch feeling both better and worse. Better because he had seen her. Worse because leaving nearly killed him. The pattern continued for 3 months. Caleb rode to Cheyenne every 2 weeks. They'd have one night together, then tear apart at dawn. Each goodbye got harder instead of easier. By March, Caleb had started to look like a man being slowly hollowed out, thinner, quieter, moving through his days with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has decided that feeling things is a luxury he can't afford. The hands noticed but said nothing except to Tommy, who said everything. This isn't working, boss. I'm handling it. You're not sleeping. You're not eating. You ride out to Cheyenne and you come back worse every time. It's working for Eliza. Is it? Morrison found Caleb one evening after the hands had turned in still in the barn, doing work that didn't need doing, and said what Tommy hadn't quite been able to. This isn't working, Walker. You're dying slowly, and from what I hear, Morrison's voice dropped, so is she. Caleb's head came up. What do you mean? Mrs. Morrison went to see her last week. Said Eliza looks thin as paper. Said she cries herself to sleep most nights. Something broke inside Caleb's chest. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a joint fails under too much weight, gradually and then completely. She was building her school. She was teaching her students. She was doing exactly what she had needed to do, and it was still killing her. Caleb rode to Cheyenne 3 days later unannounced. Found Eliza in her boarding house room in the late afternoon grading papers by lamplight, her face bent over the work with the concentration of someone trying to stay too busy to think. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway and went very still. It's not been 2 weeks, she said. I can't do this anymore. The words came out harder than he'd intended, stripped of all the careful phrasing he'd tried on during 50 miles of riding. This, the distance, the 2 weeks, the pretending we're fine when we're both falling apart. Eliza set down her pen slowly. So what are you saying? You want me to come back? Give up teaching? No, I don't know. I just know that loving you from 50 miles away is killing me. You think it's not killing me? She stood up, her hands shaking. You think I want to sleep alone every night. You think I don't hate myself for choosing this. You didn't choose this. I pushed you into it. Don't you dare. Her voice went sharp. Don't you dare take away my choice. I decided to come here. I decided to teach. You don't get to make me a victim in my own life. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Because it sounds like you're giving me an ultimatum. Choose teaching or choose you. I'm not. He stopped, ran his hands through his hair. I don't know what I'm saying. I just miss you every single day, and I don't know how much longer I can live like this. Eliza's anger crumbled under its own weight. She sat back down. The tears came quietly without the drama of collapse. I miss you too. So much it physically hurts. But I finally have what I've always wanted: students who need me, a purpose, something I'm actually good at. I can't walk away from that. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Caleb looked at this woman he loved, who looked exactly as exhausted and heartbroken as he felt, and tried to articulate the thing that had been forming in his head during 50 miles of cold riding. I'm asking if there's a way we can both have what we need, he said, without losing each other in the process. They talked through the night, fought and cried and held each other and fought some more. By dawn, they had no answers, only the same question turned over and over in their hands like a stone they couldn't put down. Caleb left at first light, rode back to the ranch with the particular heaviness of a problem that had no clean solution. 2 weeks later, he was moving cattle on the North Range when his horse hit a ground squirrel hole at a trot and went down hard. Caleb went over the horse's head. He had a moment, just one, of clear sky above him and the awareness that he was going to hit the ground badly. Then the ground hit him and the world went white. Tommy found him an hour later unconscious, his left arm bent at an angle that made the young man's stomach turn. Get him to town, Morrison said. Now. They loaded him into a wagon and drove to Cheyenne, every bump in the road making him scream, even in his unconscious state. And when they reached the doctor's office, Morrison sent word to Eliza. She arrived within the hour. She came through the door at a near-run, white-faced and terrified, and went straight past the doctor without stopping. Where is he? Back room, but ma'am, you should. She was already gone. Caleb woke to find her sitting beside his bed, holding his good hand in both of hers, tears running down her face with the steady, unhurried quality of water that has been running for a long time. Eliza. His voice came out rough with pain and medication. I'm here. She squeezed his hand. I'm right here. What happened? You got thrown. Broke your arm in 2 places, 3 ribs. The doctor says you're lucky to be alive. He tried to sit up. The pain stopped him before she did. Don't. Her voice was firm. Don't move. The doctor said complete rest for 6 weeks minimum. 6 weeks. I can't. The ranch, the spring work. Morrison is handling it. You are going to stay here in Cheyenne where I can take care of you. She met his eyes. Don't argue with me about this. Not about this. He looked at her, at the exhaustion in her face, the fear that hadn't quite left it yet, the particular quality of a woman who has just understood what she had been risking by letting distance become their habit. All right, he said. Over the next 2 weeks, Eliza moved him into her boarding house room, convinced the landlady to allow it, rearranged her teaching schedule to free up the afternoons, and settled into the work of nursing a man who hated being nursed, with the patient implacability of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. "I'm useless," he muttered one afternoon, watching her change the dressing on his arm with a competence that hadn't existed 3 months ago and had clearly been acquired through necessity. "You're healing." "Same thing." "It's absolutely not the same thing. You didn't sign up for this, for taking care of an invalid. I signed up for in sickness and in health." She tied off the bandage with a neatness that suggested she had done it enough times to stop thinking about it. "I intend to keep my word." He watched her, this woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to be his wife and had ended up 50 miles away for reasons that had made sense at the time and now felt like the worst decision either of them had ever made. "Eliza," she looked up. "I'm coming back to the ranch." She stopped, set down the bandage roll. "What?" "When I heal, I'm coming back. And I think," he hesitated, chose the words carefully, "I think we need to rebuild the plan we started with. The school on the ranch land, not the school in Cheyenne." "Caleb, I know what I said before. I know I sent you to Cheyenne because I thought it was what you needed. And maybe it was for a while, but we've been living like this for 3 months and we're both miserable and the distance isn't solving anything. It's just putting space between a problem we haven't figured out yet." She sat on the edge of his bed, her hands clasped in her lap. "If I come back," she said slowly, "I need to know there's a plan, a real plan, not just a dream I hold on to while I'm sewing curtains." "I know. A schoolhouse, built, students, families who will actually send their children. I know what I promised." And this time he met her eyes. "I'm not promising what I can't do. I'm promising what I can." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. This man with his broken arm and his broken ribs, lying in a boarding house bed in a town that wasn't his because he had ridden 50 miles to her in the dark of winter and been thrown off his horse on the way back. "All right," she said finally, "show me the plan." And they began. They stayed in Cheyenne for the rest of Caleb's recovery, 5 weeks in the small boarding house room. Him healing, her teaching, both of them talking in a way they hadn't talked since the letters. That was what the accident gave them, strange as it was, time. Time without the pressure of ranch work and winter logistics and the constant management of their separate lives. Time to sit in a room together in the evenings and figure out what they actually wanted, not what they had each independently decided was the best they could ask for. Eliza would come back from her afternoon lessons and find him sitting up in bed, with one of the books from her shelf struggling through the words with the focused determination of a man who had decided that if his wife was a schoolteacher, he could at least try to become a better reader. She didn't say anything about it the first time or the second. The third time she sat beside him on the bed and started reading aloud from where he'd left off, and they fell into a rhythm. Her voice reading him, following the words on the page, both of them inhabiting the story together. "You read beautifully," he told her one evening. "I've been doing it for 20 years. "Not for me, you haven't." She looked at him over the top of the book. Something in the observations settled quietly between them. The plan they built during those 5 weeks was not grand. It was careful and specific and full of the kind of details that separate intentions from actions. Cost per board foot of lumber, projected enrollment from families within a day's ride, and a timeline that accounted for the spring planting and the summer work, and the realities of building something from scratch with limited money and limited labor. Eliza covered both sides of 3 sheets of paper in her neat schoolteacher's hand. Caleb checked her arithmetic. They argued about the dormitory design. Eliza wanted 2 separate rooms for boys and girls. Caleb wanted 1 room with a curtain divider because 1 room was what they could afford, and in the end came to a compromise that neither of them was entirely happy with, which seemed like the right sign. 8 families, Eliza said one evening, reading from her list. "That's a conservative estimate. The Hendersons have 3 children. The Blacks have 2. The Morrison's daughter. Tommy if he wants to continue. The Reeves family if they're still in the area. A few others who might come once word spreads. That's 10 students, maybe 12. Small," she agreed, "but it's a start. And if the school has a good reputation," she paused. "If I'm good at it, you're already good at it. You've never seen me teach. I've seen what you do to Tommy. 6 months ago, he could barely read his own name. Last week, he read 2 pages from the Bible out loud at the Christmas celebration without stopping." Eliza's face softened. "He's my best student." "Tell him that. He'd probably cry." They were quiet for a moment, the comfortable quiet that had been building between them these weeks, layering itself over the earlier tension the way fresh snow covers tracks. "I want to write to the families," Eliza said. "Before we go back, let them know what we're planning, see who's interested. Write to them. It might come to nothing. It might come to something. Write the letters. She looked at him. You know, you still say that the same way you did in the letters, like hoping is the simplest thing in the world. It is the simplest thing in the world. It's everything else that's complicated. She picked up her pen and started writing. They returned to the ranch in early May, the same week the cottonwood saplings Caleb had planted the previous September pushed out their first leaves, small and bright and almost aggressively alive, as if they understood they were making a point. Eliza stood by the creek bed and looked at them for a long time. "You planted these for me," she said. It wasn't a question. "Before you arrived, they were just sticks in the ground then. They're still mostly sticks." But she was smiling when she said it. "They're growing." She reached out and touched the nearest one gently, the way you touch something you're still learning to believe in. "So are we," she said. The ranch hands greeted her return with the same barely concealed relief that suggested her absence had been harder on them than they would ever admit. Tommy, in particular, looked like a man who had been carrying something too heavy and had just been allowed to put it down. "You're back," he said with a simplicity that contained about 6 different emotions. "I'm back," she said, "and we're building the school. When? As soon as we can afford the lumber. I can help build it. I was counting on it." Morrison, true to form, said nothing dramatic. He nodded at Caleb when he rode in, nodded at Eliza and said, "Figured you'd work it out," which from Morrison was approximately equivalent to a parade. The first letters went out that same week, Eliza's careful hand addressing envelopes to the Henderson family, the Blacks, 2 other families she had learned about through Mrs. Morrison's network, a schoolmaster in Cheyenne who had mentioned once that he had more students than he could manage and might know families looking for a closer option. The responses started coming back within the month. The Henderson family's response came first, 3 children ranging from 7 to 13. Their mother's letter cramped and urgent, as if she had been waiting for exactly this possibility and was afraid it would dissolve if she wrote too slowly. "We would be deeply grateful. Our James has not had proper schooling in 2 years, and I worry every day about what he is losing." The Blacks wrote next. Then a family named Reeves, who Eliza hadn't even contacted. Apparently word had already spread through the informal channels of ranch country, woman to woman, over Sunday dinners and laundry lines, the way important information always moved in isolated communities. 8 confirmed. Eliza reported to Kayla one evening, spreading the letters across the kitchen table. 8 children for certain, possibly 2 more. The Reeves family is considering it. That's enough to justify the building. That's enough to justify the building. She looked up, and there was something in her face that he hadn't seen there before. Not excitement exactly, but the particular settled certainty of a person standing on ground that is finally solid. "Caleb, it's going to happen." "I know. I mean, I knew we planned it, but I didn't believe it until right now." "That's how things work," he said. "First you plan them, then you don't believe them, then they happen anyway." She folded the letters carefully and set them in a stack. "I need to write back to all of them. Tonight. Write to them. And we need to figure out the dormitory. 8 students means we need beds for at least. Write the letters first. The beds can wait until tomorrow." She wrote for 3 hours. Caleb sat at the other end of the table and did the ranch accounts and tried not to watch her too obviously, and mostly failed. Building the schoolhouse took the better part of 2 years. Not because they worked slowly. Caleb worked the way he always worked, which was to say relentlessly, but because money was the constraint that it had always been, and a dream the size of theirs required more lumber and glass and skilled labor than their savings could handle all at once. So they built it in sections, adding as funds allowed, financing each addition with the careful discipline of people who knew what it meant to have nothing and were not going back. The main schoolroom went up first in the fall of 1892. One large room, well lit by the south-facing windows Eliza had insisted on. "Children can't learn in the dark. Caleb, I don't care what it costs," with a proper wood stove and enough desk space for 12 students. The walls were white like the cabin. The shelves were built by Caleb himself, measuring 3 times this time and getting it right. Tommy and Jack worked alongside him most evenings and weekends, learning construction skills they'd never needed before and approaching the work with the particular enthusiasm of men who understood what they were building. "This is for all the kids who grow up out here," Tommy said one afternoon, nailing boards to the frame with the focused intensity of someone making a point. "Kids like I was. Never had a school within riding distance. Never had anybody think it was worth making the effort." Caleb paused his own work. "Is that what you think this is?" "Isn't it?" Caleb looked at the frame of the schoolhouse rising against the Wyoming sky. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly what it is." The dormitory addition came the following spring, 2 rooms in the end, because Eliza had been right about the boys and girls needing separate spaces, and Caleb had found a way to make the numbers work. Small rooms, tight, but with proper beds and proper warmth, and the dignity that came from being planned rather than improvised. The first student arrived in September of 1894. His name was Michael Henderson, 10 years old, riding 20 miles on a horse that looked too big for him with a pack on his back that contained everything he owned. He stood in front of the schoolhouse and looked at it with the expression of a child who has been told something wonderful is waiting and is not quite sure he has found the right place. Eliza came out onto the steps and looked down at him. "You must be Michael," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He clutched the pack strap. Is this the right place?" "This is exactly the right place. Come in." Caleb was watching from the cabin porch 50 yards away. He saw the boy's shoulders drop slightly, the small physical release of fear giving way to something better, and felt something in his own chest he hadn't felt since the day Eliza had stepped off the train. This was what the letters had been for. Not just the love story, the school at the end of it. The purpose, the building of something that would outlast them both. By October, there were 5 students. By the following spring, there were 9 ranging in age from 7 to 15, crowded into the schoolroom with the particular energy of children who had been underestimated and were determined to make up for lost time. Caleb would come home from the day's work to hear Eliza's voice through the schoolroom window. Patient, clear, occasionally exasperated, always present. He would hear the scratching of slates, the sound of a child reading aloud, the particular silence of people concentrating. "How'd it go?" he'd ask in the evenings. Michael read his first full paragraph without stopping. Her face when she said things like this, lit from within the way a window looks when there's warmth inside. He looked up at me when he finished, and he didn't even know he was crying. He didn't know. He was 12. 12-year-old boys don't think they cry. She smiled. But he did. The school developed its own rhythm, separate from, but interwoven with the rhythm of the ranch mornings. Where ranch work, afternoons were lessons. Evenings were the shared territory of whatever needed doing. On weekends, when the boarding students went home to their families, the ranch returned to its earlier quiet. Those weekend evenings became their own kind of ritual. Caleb would come in from the last of the day's work to find Eliza on the porch in the rocking chair, with a book, the light fading, the land going golden, and then dark around her. He would sit beside her, and sometimes they would talk, and sometimes they wouldn't, and either way, it was enough. "Tell me something I don't know," she said one evening in the fall of 1895, the same invitation he had offered her that first terrified night. He thought about it. "When I was mending the west fence today, I found a hawk's nest in the juniper. 3 eggs. Will they hatch before winter? Probably not, but next spring." She was quiet, looking at the darkening horizon. "I think I'm pregnant," she said. The words arrived in the quiet the way important things often did between them, without preamble, without drama, simply stated because it was true. Caleb turned to look at her. She was still looking at the horizon, her hands folded in her lap, her face doing the thing it did when she was frightened and trying not to be. "How long have you known?" 2 weeks. I wasn't certain." A pause. "I'm still not certain, but—" Is this?" He stopped. Tried again. "Are you all right?" She turned to look at him finally, terrified. "So am I. What if something goes wrong? What if something goes right?" She looked at him. "You and your relentless optimism. One of us has to have it." She reached across and took his hand, held it in the gathering dark. "I can't stop teaching," she said. "I know some people would say I should, but these children, nobody's asking you to stop. Some people will. Some people aren't the ones who built this school or who live in it. Their opinions don't count." She squeezed his hand. "What if I'm terrible at it, being a mother? You're the best teacher I've ever seen, and the only one I know, but I suspect the same qualities that make you good at that will make you good at this." "What qualities?" "Patience, honesty, the ability to know when someone needs to be pushed and when they need to be held." He looked at her, and the absolute refusal to let the people you care about give up on themselves. Eliza was quiet for a moment, then, "When I write it down like that, I sound almost capable." "You are capable. You're the most capable person I've ever met." "You'd say that even if it weren't true." "I'd say it especially if it weren't true to make you believe it until it was. But it is true, so—" She laughed, the real one, the one that crinkled the corners of her eyes. He had been cataloging that laugh for 3 years now, adding new versions of it to the collection. The reluctant one, the surprised one, the one that was also slightly exasperated with him. This one was the grateful kind. Their daughter was born in a spring storm in April of 1896. Mrs. Morrison came to assist, and Caleb paced the length of the porch for 6 hours in the cold rain, listening to sounds from inside the cabin that he could not interpret and would not allow himself to catalog. Tommy sat with him for part of it, and Morrison for part of it, and for the rest, he was alone with the rain and the dark and the specific kind of fear that has no object except time. When Mrs. Morrison finally opened the cabin door, her expression told him, before she said anything, that it was all right. "Go in," she said simply. "She's asking for you." Eliza was in the bed, exhausted in the way that went beyond tiredness, into some territory that didn't have a name, her hair loose and damp, her face doing something that looked like it couldn't decide between laughing and crying. In her arms was a bundle the size of nothing wrapped in the blue blanket Mrs. Morrison had brought, making sounds so small that Caleb stopped in the doorway because he was afraid of disturbing something. "Come here," Eliza said. He crossed the room. She held up the bundle. The child was red and scrunched and making faces at being in the world, and she was the most extraordinary thing Caleb had ever seen. He took her carefully, the way he had once learned to handle newborn calves. But this was nothing like that. This was something for which there was no prior preparation, and felt her weight settle against his chest with the naturalness of something returning to where it was supposed to be. He could not have said anything. He did not try. "She's perfect," he managed after a long time. His voice was not steady. "She's ours," Eliza said. The simplicity of it contained everything. They named her Grace. It was Eliza's suggestion, and Caleb agreed without debate, because it was exactly right, Grace being what they had been given, both of them in ways neither deserved and both had come to understand. Grace grew the way children do in ranch country, fast and sturdy, shaped by the outdoors, unafraid of animals or weather or hard work. By the time she was 3, she had strong opinions about everything and expressed them without hesitation, which Eliza attributed to nature and Caleb attributed to being raised by Eliza. The school grew alongside her. By 1900, there were 15 students, and families were choosing to settle near the Walker Ranch, specifically because of the schoolhouse. The way good schools always shape the communities around them, drawing people who understood what education meant for their children's future. Caleb expanded the ranch slowly in these years with the same careful discipline that had governed everything else. Not gambling, not overextending, but building. Adding acreage when the price was right, improving the herd quality with better breeding stock, hiring hands who were good at the work and could be trusted with it. He was 30 years old and feeling for the first time like a man who was standing where he had been trying to get to. In 1902, their son was born. They named him James after no one in particular. They simply liked the sound of it, the solidity of it, the way it sounded like someone who would stand up in a room. He was born easy compared to Grace's arrival on a calm October morning, while Caleb was bringing in the last of the fall cattle. Tommy rode out to get him. "Mrs. Walker says it's time, boss, and she says don't you dare be late." And Caleb made it back to find Eliza sitting up in bed, looking faintly smug and exhausted with a boy already latched at her breast. "You named a horse James last spring," Eliza said before he could speak. "I renamed the horse." "What to?" "Franklin." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. "James is better." Grace, 4 years old and deeply opinionated, was allowed in to inspect her brother. She studied him with the critical attention of a child who has learned not to be impressed by things until they prove themselves. "He's small," she said. "He'll get bigger," Caleb told her. "He better." She reached out one careful finger and touched the baby's cheek. Her face did something complicated and then settled. "I'll teach him things," she announced. "Good," Eliza said. "Start with the alphabet." "He can't even talk." "Then wait a year." Grace considered this. "All right." She sat down on the floor beside the bed with the air of someone who has accepted a commission. "I'll wait." Caleb looked at Eliza over the top of their daughter's head. Something moved through her eyes, amusement and love, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has just done something extraordinarily hard and is already thinking about what comes next. "How are you?" he asked. "Tired? Glad, very glad." A pause. "And a little hungry. Mrs. Morrison brought a pie." "I saw it, rhubarb." "My favorite." "I know." She smiled at him, the full one, the one that meant something beyond just the current moment. He had been married to this woman for 10 years, and the full smile still did things to his chest that he suspected nothing would ever make ordinary. "Caleb, we built something." She said it quietly, as if to herself as much as to him, looking around the cabin that had grown over the decade from 1 room to 3, the additions unplanned, born out of necessity, constructed on weekends and evenings until the original cabin was barely recognizable as its own beginning. We actually built something. We did. I didn't believe it for a while. When I was in Cheyenne, when I thought I'd have to choose, you didn't have to choose. I know, but I thought I did. And now, she looked down at the baby and across at Grace sitting sentinel on the floor and out the window at the schoolhouse with its south-facing windows and its full complement of students. Now I can't imagine what we were so afraid of. Being wrong, he said, about each other. Were we? No. She reached up and took his hand. No, she agreed, we weren't. Outside, the October light was gold and long. Across the land, the kind of light that belonged to autumn in Wyoming, clear and cool and honest. In the schoolhouse, the afternoon lessons had ended an hour ago, but two students were still at their desks, visible through the window, working on something by lamplight, because they wanted to, not because anyone had asked them to. Caleb looked at them from the window and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something that continues without him. This was it. This was what he had been writing toward all those years in the bunkhouse, with Dutch Henderson watching him across the room and calling him a fool. Not the love story, although that, but also this, the school and the children and the land and the two lives intertwined so thoroughly now that neither one could be easily described without the other. He had written 300 letters into silence. She had read every one. And all of this was where the silence had led. In the years that followed, the Walker Schoolhouse became something of a fixed point in that part of Wyoming, a place families oriented themselves toward, a landmark, both literal and otherwise. Teachers who had trained under Eliza went on to establish schools of their own in neighboring counties. Students who had learned to read in the schoolhouse's one main room went on to become ranchers, doctors, lawyers, teachers. Caleb kept his own ledger of them, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had always found meaning in bearing witness. Michael Henderson first enrolled September 1894, now a lawyer in Cheyenne, has a daughter who cannot stop reading. Tommy Briggs, ranch hand, then foreman, then owner of his own small spread, still sends money to the school fund every spring. Sarah Morrison, teacher, has her mother's practical eyes and her father's patience, currently runs the county's largest schoolroom. He showed the ledger to Eliza one winter evening, expecting nothing in particular. She sat with it for a long time, turning the pages slowly, reading each entry. When she set it down, she didn't say anything for a while. "You've been keeping this for years," she said, "since Michael arrived." Why? He thought about it. Because they matter. Because someone should keep track of who they were and what they became. He looked at her. Because I know what it's like to need someone to bear witness. She understood what he meant. She always did. "Do you still have them?" she asked. "The letters." "On the shelf in the study." The study was what they called the third room of the cabin, added after Grace was born, which contained books and the ranch's account ledgers and the shelf where Caleb's 300 letters sat in their row. He hadn't moved them since the day he'd lined them up in the original cabin and asked out loud what he was doing. "Can I reread them sometime?" "They were always yours." She went in that evening, and he heard her in there for 2 hours, the cabin quiet around him and the children in bed and the fire burning down. When she came out, her eyes were red, but her expression was something he hadn't seen before. A kind of completed peace, as if she had been carrying an unfinished conversation for a long time and had finally reached the last page. "You were so lonely," she said. "I was. And you wrote to me anyway, for 7 years. For 7 years. Why did you keep going after the first year with no answer? After the second, because stopping would have meant giving up on the idea that the world was large enough to contain someone who understood loneliness the way I did. And I wasn't ready to give up on that." He looked at her. I was right, as it turned out. She crossed the room and sat beside him at the table, close enough that their arms touched. The fire was mostly embers now, outside, the Wyoming night pressed against the windows. "I want to write something," she said. "A letter, to you. You've written 50 letters to me. Not like this one. Not with everything." She looked at him. "There are things I never put in writing. Things I wanted to say and kept finding reasons not to. I want to put them down." "All right. Will you read it when I'm done?" "Every word," he said, "like I always have." She sat at the table that night after he'd gone to bed, and she wrote, and he lay in the dark and listened to the sound of pen on paper. A sound he knew better than almost any other. A sound that had shaped his entire life and felt something so large and complete that he had no name for it. In the morning, there was a letter on the table sealed with his name on the front in her careful school teacher's hand. He opened it over coffee, alone in the early morning quiet. Caleb, I want to tell you what it was like receiving your letters. I want you to know that the first one arrived on a Tuesday in April, and I read it so many times the paper started to soften at the folds. I want you to know that I wrote you back a dozen times, maybe more, and destroyed every letter before it could be sent, because I was afraid of what it would start, afraid of wanting something I didn't believe I could have. I want you to know that the letters you sent about the blizzard kept me company through my father's worst winter. That I read the one about Dutch Henderson's funeral on the night my father finally died, and somehow it helped. That there was not a single letter you sent that I did not need exactly when it arrived. I want you to know that I was never indifferent. I was only afraid. And I want you to know that every day of the 33 years we have been married, I have been grateful not just for you, but for myself. For the version of me that finally got on the train. With all the love I have and more than I know how to write down, Eliza. Caleb read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it with the 300 letters on the shelf. Then he went outside to start the morning's work, and the day was clear and cold, and the cottonwoods along the creek bed were bare in the winter air. But fully grown now, 15 years old, their roots as deep as anything he had ever built. He stood among them for a while, his breath making small clouds in the cold, and felt the weight of 33 years as something good, dense, and warm, and utterly his, the way only the things you have chosen can ever fully be. They had built all of this, he and Eliza, out of silence, out of hope, out of the stubborn refusal to stop reaching towards something that most people would have called impossible. He went back inside and found Eliza in the kitchen, already awake, already making the first pot of coffee, humming something under her breath that he'd been hearing her hum for 30 years and still hadn't been able to identify. "Did you read it?" she asked without turning around. "Yes, and I put it with the others." She turned. Her face in the morning light was 58 years old and completely familiar, and still able, after all this time, to make him forget what he'd been about to say. "Good," she said. "It belongs there." He sat down at the table. She brought him coffee. The children, both of them grown, both of them somewhere out in the world being themselves, were not here this morning, would not be here until Christmas, and the cabin was quiet with the particular quality of shared solitude. "What do you want to do today?" she asked. It was a question she had asked him thousands of times over 30 years, and the answer was always some version of the same thing: the work, the land, the school, the life they had built. Today was no different. But before he answered, he looked at her, really looked the way he had looked on a train platform in September of 1892, when she had been a stranger and everything was still possibility. "This," he said, "just this." She smiled, the full one. Outside, the cottonwoods stood in their row by the frozen creek, patient and certain, reaching toward a sky they had been reaching toward since the day a young man planted them as a promise. They had become exactly what they were always going to become. The winter of 1908 was the second worst Caleb could remember. Not as catastrophic as the blizzard year of his youth, but sustained in a way that was almost worse, the cold arriving in November and simply refusing to leave like a guest who had forgotten they were supposed to have a deadline. The school was full that year, 16 students ranging from 6 to 16, sleeping in the small dormitory with its 2 rooms and its single wood stove that Caleb kept loaded all night when the temperature dropped below certain thresholds. The older students took turns getting up to feed it. There was something in this arrangement, this communal management of shared warmth, that seemed to Caleb to be exactly right. Something that no textbook could have taught them. He mentioned it to Eliza one evening, watching through the window as 2 of the older boys made their way to the woodpile in the dark, their breath clouding in the cold. "They're learning to take care of each other," he said. "That's always been the point," she said. "Reading and arithmetic are tools. How to take care of each other, that's the education." He turned to look at her. She was grading papers at the table, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, her hair gone silver at the temples. Now her hands moving through the stack with the practiced efficiency of nearly 2 decades of doing this exact thing. He had watched her grade papers more times than he could count. He never got tired of it. "Do you remember," he said, "what you wrote in the letter about being afraid of disappointing me?" She looked up. "Which one?" I wrote to the house that sentiment in approximately 17 letters. "The first one. The one where you said you were plain and practical and didn't own 3 proper dresses." "I remember. I want you to know." He paused, searching for the exact right words, the way he had never been good at in person and had only ever managed on paper. "I want you to know that I have thought about that letter many times over the years. And every single time I think about what you wrote, and then I look at you, and I don't understand what you were afraid of." Eliza set down her pen. "Caleb, I mean it. You described a woman I might not want, and what walked off that train was everything I had been writing toward without knowing it. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was the complicated one, the one that contained gratitude and exasperation and love, all layered together, the one he had come to think of as simply her face. "You're in a mood tonight," she said. "I just wanted to say it." "You say it." "Not enough. More than you think." She picked up her pen again. "More than you know." He went back to his account ledger, and she went back to her papers, and the fire crackled between them, and the winter did its work outside and inside the schoolhouse. The stove was warm, and the students were sleeping, and everything was as it should be. Grace left for normal school in 1914. She was 18, and she had decided she wanted to be a teacher the way some children decide they want to be the sky, not because they chose it, but because they couldn't imagine being anything else. The morning she left, she stood on the porch with her bag and looked at the schoolhouse and the cabin and the cottonwoods along the creek bed, which were proper trees, now tall enough to provide real shade in summer, their roots tangled deep in the Wyoming earth. "I'm coming back," she said. Not to her parents specifically, to the place itself. "I know," Eliza said. "I'm going to run it better than either of you." "Probably," Caleb said. Grace looked at him. She had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and something that was entirely her own, a quality he had no name for except that it made everyone in a room know she was present. "Thank you," she said, "for building this." He didn't know how to answer that. He looked at Eliza. "Thank your father," Eliza said. "He planted the trees before I ever arrived." Grace looked at the cottonwoods, looked back at Caleb. "I know too," she said. "He told me." She hugged them both and got on her horse and rode north toward the main road, and Caleb and Eliza stood on the porch and watched her go until she was out of sight. "She'll be extraordinary," Eliza said. "She already is. She gets it from both of us." "She gets it from you." "Stop it." But she was smiling. They stood on the porch until the horizon was empty again, and then they went back and saw to the ordinary work of an ordinary day, and the school ran itself for the afternoon on the strength of the older students who had been trained long enough to be trusted, and the cottonwoods stood in their row beside the creek, and the sun moved across the sky in its long arc, and everything continued. James left 4 years later, at 17, to take up work on a neighboring ranch larger than his father's, with land enough to absorb a young man's ambition. He came back every Christmas and every summer, reliably, and without being asked, and when he was home, he was entirely home present in a way that some of the students tried to imitate. "He learned that from you," Eliza told Caleb. "Learned what? How to be fully somewhere. How to be present in a place without always thinking about the next place." Caleb thought about this. "I learned it from the letters," he said. "When you're writing to someone who isn't there, you learn to be all the way somewhere because you're trying to give them the whole of a place in words." Eliza was quiet. "I never thought of it that way. 7 years is a long time to practice being present. And 30 more on top of that." "And 30 more," he agreed. She leaned against him on the porch, and he put his arm around her, and they stood watching the last of the day's light leave the sky over Wyoming. "I'm glad I got on the train," she said. It was something she said occasionally, not often, not as reassurance, but as a simple statement of fact, the way she might observe that the weather had turned or that the creek was running high. It had always meant the same thing and always would. "So am I," he said. The cottonwoods moved in the evening breeze, and the schoolhouse windows were dark because the day's lessons were done, and somewhere across the ranch a calf was calling for its mother in the blue hour before full dark. They stood together on the porch they had stood on together 1,000 times, these two people who had found each other through paper and ink and the stubborn refusal to give up on something that couldn't be proven, and watch the night come in over the land they had built their life on. This was what love looked like, Caleb thought, when it had been allowed to grow at its own pace and put down real roots. Not the grand gestures, not the drama of the train platform, though that had been real and necessary in its own way. This standing somewhere familiar with someone who knew you entirely in the ordinary dark, with the work done for the day, and tomorrow's work already waiting, and nowhere else in the world that either of you would rather be. 300 letters, 33 years, a schoolhouse, 2 children, a row of cottonwood trees, everything he had ever hoped for and more. The letter arrived on a Thursday in early March of 1920, on a morning when Caleb was out checking the south fence line and Eliza was teaching her Thursday session, a smaller class now, the older students mostly grown and gone, but she had rebuilt the enrollment every few years as new families arrived, as they always did, drawn by the school's reputation. It came from a woman named Clara Fontaine, a journalist from Denver, who wrote for one of the larger papers there. Dear Mrs. Walker, I am writing a piece about the educational legacy of the American West and have heard through several sources about the Walker Schoolhouse and the extraordinary history behind its founding. I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you and your husband about how it began, if you would be willing. I have specifically heard about the letters, the correspondence that preceded your marriage. If this is a subject you would be willing to discuss, I believe readers would find it deeply moving. Eliza read it twice, set it on the kitchen table where Caleb would find it when he came in. He read it at lunch, still in his work coat, standing at the table with one hand holding the letter and the other wrapped around his coffee cup. What do you want to do? He asked. I don't know. She sat down across from him. Part of me wants to say no. Those letters were ours. Private. They were. But they're also, she stopped. There are things in them that aren't just ours. Things about what it means to be lonely. What it means to keep hoping when there's no evidence that hoping is reasonable. She looked at her hands. I've had students tell me things over the years about their own loneliness, about feeling unseen. And I've thought sometimes I know what that is. I wrote about it in letters I never sent. I felt that. You think it might help someone? I don't know if that's my call to make. Caleb set down the coffee cup. It was your loneliness too. You get a say. She was quiet for a long moment. What would you want? She asked. He thought about it honestly. I think when I wrote those letters, I was writing partly because I was afraid of disappearing, of being unknown, a name on a grave nobody visits. He met her eyes. If people read them, if they knew we existed, really knew it, I don't think Dutch Henderson's ghost would have much to say. She almost smiled. Dutch Henderson would have plenty to say. He'd say something cutting and then secretly be pleased. Probably. She looked at the letter again. All right, write to her. Tell her she can come. Clara Fontaine arrived in April, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a reporter's economy of motion, who looked at the schoolhouse and the cabin and the cottonwoods and wrote in her notebook without saying what she was thinking. She spent 3 days with them. She read the letters. Not all of them, there were too many, but enough sitting at the kitchen table with the stack before her reading in the silence of someone who had expected to be professionally interested and had found herself personally moved. When you wrote the one about not wanting to die unknown, she said to Caleb on the second day, did you think anyone would read it besides her? No, he said. I wrote it for Eliza, if she read it. But you kept writing even when she didn't answer. Yes. For 7 years. Yes. She looked at him with the expression of a woman revising an assessment. Most people would have stopped after 6 months. Most people weren't as lonely as I was. Or as stubborn, Eliza said from across the room. That too, he agreed. The article ran in May. The Cowboy Who Wrote 300 Letters, the headline read. Caleb found it in the paper that came up on the supply wagon and read it on the porch while Eliza was in the schoolhouse. And the experience was strange, like reading about someone he knew well from the outside, seeing the shape of a life he had lived from a perspective that was not his own. Clara had been careful with the letters. She had not quoted from them extensively, only enough to give the reader the texture of them, the quality of a young man's loneliness and hope, and stubborn refusal to give up on something unprovable. She had described the school, the children, the cottonwood trees. She had described Eliza's face when she talked about her students and Caleb's hands when he handled the original letters careful as if the paper were still fragile after nearly 30 years. What Walker Ranch represents, the piece concluded, is not just a love story, though it is certainly that. It is the story of what happens when two people refuse to believe that their own lives are too small to matter. A schoolhouse stands in the Wyoming hills because a lonely boy wrote letters for 7 years into silence, and because a lonely woman finally found the courage to answer. Every child who has learned to read under that roof is proof that hope persisted and long enough builds something permanent. Eliza read it at the kitchen table, and when she finished, she sat for a while without saying anything. It's good, she said finally. Yes, she understood it. She did. Eliza set the paper down. Dutch Henderson would hate it. With his whole heart, Caleb agreed. Letters came after the article, dozens of them eventually from people across Colorado and Wyoming and Kansas and places farther away than that. People who had been lonely. People who were still lonely. People who had been afraid to hope for something they couldn't prove was possible. Eliza answered all of them. Every single one in the neat school teacher's hand that had not changed in 30 years, with the patience of a woman who understood that sometimes a letter was the only form that certain kinds of honesty could take. Caleb watched her work through the stack one evening and thought of himself at 18 bent over paper in a lamplit bunkhouse while Dutch Henderson made jokes and the wind shook the walls. "You're doing what I did," he said. She looked up. "What do you mean?" "Writing back, all those letters from strangers, you're writing back to every one of them." "Of course." "Why of course?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I know what it means when someone writes into silence and actually gets an answer." He had nothing to say to that. He picked up his own reading and let her work. Grace came home from normal school in 1921 with a teaching certificate, and 3 months later, a husband named Daniel Reeves, the son of the same Reeves family, who had been among the school's first potential students 27 years ago. He was a quiet, careful man who was good with his hands and better with his words, and who looked at Grace with the particular attention of someone who understood they had acquired something remarkable. "I like him," Caleb told Eliza the evening after the wedding. "I know you do. You told him 3 times. "Once. 3 times. I was counting. Twice, maybe." She gave him the look. He conceded the point. Grace took over the school formally that fall. She was 25 years old, trained experience from substitute teaching summers, and possessed of ideas about curriculum and student development that were, Caleb admitted, privately better than what either he or Eliza had managed from instinct alone. The handover was not dramatic. One Monday morning, Eliza arrived at the schoolhouse as usual, found Grace already at the front of the room, and stopped in the doorway. "Oh," Eliza said, quietly, the way you say something when you have known it was coming for a long time, and it still surprises you. Grace looked at her. "Sit in today. I'd like your opinion on how I handle the older ones." It was gracefully done, not a displacement, but an invitation, the kind that left both parties their dignity. Eliza sat in the back of the room with her hands folded and watched her daughter teach, and her expression was the complicated one. The layered one, the one that Caleb could never fully read, but always recognized. That evening, he found Eliza on the porch. She had a cup of tea going cold beside her and was looking at nothing in particular, or rather at the cottonwood trees, which were full-grown now, their canopies shading the creek bed in summer, their roots reaching all the way down into the water table. He sat beside her without asking. "How did it feel?" he said, watching her. A long pause. "Like standing at a window and seeing yourself from the outside." She wrapped both hands around the cooling cup. "Like, I know that's what good teaching looks like because she learned it from watching me, boy, and she's better than I was at her age. And I'm so proud of her that it hurts. But nothing really. It's a feeling I didn't expect. Like the school doesn't need me in the same way anymore." "Does anything need you less when it grows well?" She looked at him. "Your students couldn't read when they arrived," he said. "Now they can. You didn't want them to stay unable to read forever, so you'd still be necessary." "That's different." "Is it?" She was quiet. The cottonwoods moved in the evening air, that particular sound like a river running that Caleb had been hearing for 30 years and never stopped finding restful. "When did you get so wise?" she said. "I had a good teacher." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite not. "That's too easy." "It's true, though." She leaned against him, her shoulder against his arm, the familiar weight of 30 years, and they sat on the porch while the day finished itself and the schoolhouse windows went dark. "Caleb, what do you think about when you think about the letters now, I mean, after all this time?" He considered it honestly. "I think about how afraid I was, how much I wanted to stop writing and couldn't, how the act of putting things into words, sending them into the air, even when no one seemed to be listening, was the only way I knew to be a person, and not just a function. A function, a pair of hands on a ranch, a body doing work. Without the letters, I wasn't sure there was much else to me. There was everything else to you. I know that now." She turned to look at him. "And what do you think about me? About the fact that I didn't write back for 7 years? I think you were surviving." He met her eyes. "I think you were doing exactly what you had to do with exactly the resources you had. And I think," a pause, "I think it turned out to be exactly the right amount of time. 7 years. 7 years. Long enough that I'd become someone worth the distance. Long enough that you'd become someone willing to take the risk." He paused. "Any sooner and we might have been wrong about each other." She looked at him for a long time. In the fading light, her face was 58 years old and familiar in every detail and still somehow capable of surprising him. "I used to be afraid," she said, "that you would eventually figure out I wasn't worth it. All those years of letters, you had built me up into something, and I was afraid the real me would be a disappointment. And now, she turned back to the cottonwoods. "Now I'm afraid that I wasn't brave enough for long enough and that someday you'll look at the years we spent apart and think about what we lost." "I don't." "You're sure?" The years apart are part of the same story. They're not separate from it. He reached out and took her hand. You couldn't have written back before you were ready, and I couldn't have been the man you needed until I'd spent 7 years trying to be worth it. He held her hand. It all had to be the way it was. She pressed her thumb against the back of his hand, the gesture she had used since the first night in the dark, when she had found his hand and held on. All right, she said, I believe you. Good, it's true. The last of the light left the sky. The cottonwoods settled into their evening stillness. Somewhere in the schoolhouse, Grace was finishing up whatever she was doing. They could see the last lamplight in the window, a small gold square in the dark. Our daughter is in there planning better lessons than either of us ever thought of, Eliza said. Probably. James called her a force of nature last Christmas. He wasn't wrong. He gets that from you, the plain speaking. He gets everything useful from you. She bumped her shoulder against him. Stop being modest. It's uncharacteristic. He smiled. All right, he gets the stubbornness from me. Thank you, that's more honest. They sat until the last of the light was entirely gone, and the schoolhouse window finally went dark, and then they went inside to the warmth of the cabin that had grown from one room to four. Over the decades, the original walls of it still there at the core, the place where everything had begun. In 1922, a man named Edmund Carr rode up to the ranch on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, a young man barely 20 with the specific quality of someone who has come a long distance with a specific purpose and is uncertain of his welcome. Caleb was on the porch when he arrived. Mr. Walker. That's right. My name is Edmund Carr. My grandmother was Margaret Henderson. She was one of the first students at your school. He paused. And my grandfather was a man who read your letters in the newspaper article. He said you wrote one about not wanting to die unknown, about wanting to be remembered. He looked at Caleb steadily. My grandfather kept that piece of paper for 20 years. When he died last spring, it was in his coat pocket. Caleb looked at the young man standing in the rain with his hat in his hands. Come inside, he said. My wife should hear this. They sat at the kitchen table, Eliza and Caleb on one side, Edmund Carr on the other, with tea going warm between them, and the young man told him about his grandfather. A rancher in northeastern Wyoming who had read the article in 1920 and had recognized something in the description of Caleb's letters that he'd never seen described before. He said he felt that way too, Edmund said. Afraid of disappearing, he never told anyone. He was from the kind of family where you didn't. He looked at his hands, but he kept that piece of paper. And when I found it in his coat, I don't know. I wanted to come and tell you. It seemed important that you know. The kitchen was very quiet. Eliza looked at Caleb. Her expression was the one he had no name for, the one that contained everything. Your grandfather knew, she said finally to Edmund. He knew and he kept it with him. That means more than you might realize. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Because the people who need those words most are often the ones least able to ask for them. The fact that he carried it with him, that's a conversation he was having with himself for 20 years that nobody knew about. She looked at Edmund. He wasn't alone. Even if he felt alone, he had that piece of paper. Edmund Carr left the next morning with a copy of the original newspaper article, which Eliza had kept in the study with the letters. He shook Caleb's hand at the door with a seriousness that was more than politeness. Thank you, he said, for writing all those years. Caleb looked at the young man, barely older than he himself had been, when he'd written the first letter, still carrying the shape of something not yet fully formed. Thank your grandmother, he said. She came to school because her mother believed in it. And because of that, you exist, and you can read, and you found that piece of paper in your grandfather's coat instead of him taking it to the grave without anyone knowing. He paused. Every part of it matters. Edmund nodded, rode north into the morning. Eliza came to stand beside Caleb in the doorway as the young man's horse shrank into the distance. Every part of it matters, she repeated quietly. It does. Even the 7 years of silence. He looked at her. Especially that. She slipped her hand into his. They stood in the doorway of the cabin they had built their life in and watched Edmund Carr ride away and listened to the cottonwoods along the creek moving in the morning wind. And the schoolhouse behind them was empty because it was Wednesday and Grace didn't teach on Wednesdays, but tomorrow it would be full again, and the day after that, and the day after that. The story was still going. It had never been only theirs. James came home that Christmas with news. He had been managing the neighboring Whitmore Ranch for 4 years and had in that time turned a struggling operation into a profitable one through the particular combination of his father's stubbornness and his mother's organizational intelligence. Now at 20, he was being offered a partnership, a real one, with an ownership stake, the kind of opportunity that came once in a working man's life. He laid it out at the kitchen table after Christmas dinner, his manner precise and his face carefully neutral in a way that told Caleb he had already decided and was presenting it for consideration rather than permission. What does Whitmore want in return? Caleb asked. 5 years minimum commitment. He wants continuity. And after 5 years, option to buy him out. He's 63, no children. He wants the ranch to go to someone who will run it right. Caleb looked at his son across the table, the careful face that measured words, the hands already shaped by years of work. What do you want? He asked. James looked at him directly. I want to own something, build something. A pause, like you did. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Take the partnership, Caleb said. Eliza looked at him. Don't you want to think about it? I thought about it while he was talking. He kept his eyes on James. Take it. 5 years is nothing. You'll spend all 5 of them learning things you don't know yet, and you'll come out the other end knowing how to run a ranch twice this size. He paused. The buyout is the point. Work toward that. James nodded slowly. Something in his face softened in the way that faces do when they receive permission. They'd already decided they didn't need, but find they wanted anyway. Thank you, he said. Thank yourself. You did the work that made someone willing to make the offer. Later, after James had gone to bed, Eliza sat beside Caleb on the porch in the cold December air, bundled in the shawl he had given her, their first Christmas, now 28 years old and carefully mended. You sounded like your letters, she said. Did I? The one where you wrote about Dutch dying, about not wanting to be unknown. She pulled the shawl tighter. You've always known what it means to build something from nothing. You've always known that's what matters. I learned it from watching you build the school. We built it together. You built it. I supplied the lumber. She looked at him sideways. You planned it. You funded it. You convinced Morrison to give us the time. You built the shelves. 3 times because I kept getting the measurements wrong. 4 times. I thought you were being kind about that. I was. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was endearing. They sat in the cold night and let the silence do its work between them. The comfortable silence of people who know each other well enough to not require filling it. I've been thinking, Eliza said finally. About what? About the letters. About writing something, not a letter, but something longer. A history of the school, what we tried to do and why and how it actually turned out. She was quiet for a moment. For Grace mostly, and for whoever comes after Grace, so they know where it came from. So it doesn't disappear. Yes, he thought about it. Will you include the letters? The parts that matter, the parts that explain why any of this happened. She looked up at him. Is that all right? He looked at the schoolhouse in the dark, now quiet but full tomorrow, full of children who would read and cipher and argue and grow and leave and carry something of this place with them into lives neither he nor Eliza would live long enough to see. More than all right, he said. She started writing the history that winter, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, her pen moving in the particular rhythm he had known for 30 years, building something out of words, the way he had always built things out of wood and work. He didn't read it until she was done. She gave it to him on a Sunday afternoon in March, a thick sheaf of papers, her handwriting covering both sides, the story of the school told from its beginning in an 1892 newspaper correspondence column all the way to the present. He read it through once without stopping. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the wall for a while. Well, she said, it's good. Is it accurate? You were more frightened in the early days than you let on, especially the first winter. I know, I wrote it honestly. You also wrote me as more patient than I was. That first fight when you cried and I told you to stop apologizing, I was clumsier than that. I didn't know what I was doing. Nobody knows what they're doing in their first fight, she said. They just do it anyway and figure out what they meant afterward. He looked at her. You should have it bound, proper like a book. There are places in Cheyenne that do that. Then take it. Get it bound. He looked at the pages. Put a copy in the school's library, another in the study with the letters, he paused, and give one to Grace. I was going to give it to Grace. I know, I just wanted to say it. The bound copy was ready in April. The binder in Cheyenne had done it properly. Cloth cover, good paper, the title lettered on the front in careful gold, The Walker School, a History. Grace held it for a long time before she opened it. You wrote this for me, she said. For you and for the children who will come after you. Grace looked at her mother with an expression Caleb recognized from 30 years of watching Eliza, the complicated one, the layered one. "I'll keep it as long as the school stands," she said. "Longer," Eliza said. The summer of 1924 was the hottest Caleb could remember, longer and more relentless than any he'd experienced, the kind of heat that baked the color out of the landscape and made the air shimmer above the pastures like something alive. The cattle suffered. The creek ran low. The garden beside the cabin produced less than half its usual yield, and Eliza spent the evenings reading about dry farming methods and crop rotation and the new techniques being developed in the agricultural colleges. "We should try winter wheat," she said one evening. "Morrison used to talk about it. Morrison's been in Denver for 4 years." "I know, but the idea was sound." She showed him the article she'd been reading. "Look at these figures." He looked at the figures. "You want to plant wheat. I want to not have 2 bad summers in a row. Wheat is hardier than what we're growing now, if we rotate correctly." "Where'd you learn about crop rotation?" She gave him the look. "I've been reading." "For how long?" "Since March, when this dry spring started. I thought you might dismiss it." "I'm not dismissing it. I'm asking questions." She explained clearly and methodically, the way she would explain a lesson to an older student, not talking down but not assuming either. He listened and asked questions and pushed back where the numbers seemed thin, and she answered each one with the particular confidence of a woman who had done her homework. By the end of the evening, he had agreed to try 4 acres in winter wheat. "You've been farming without me," he said. "I've been thinking about farming without you. You're the one who's going to dig the ground. 40 years married and she's still correcting me. 40 years married and you're still worth correcting." She closed the agriculture pamphlet with a decisive snap. "Go to sleep. We're starting on those 4 acres tomorrow." He lay in the dark and listened to her breathing settle into sleep and thought about the fact that she was still surprising him, still bringing new angles on things he thought he understood, still, after everything, someone he was genuinely interested in. This was the thing no letter had quite prepared him for, not because the letters had been wrong about her, but because they described a person, and what he'd found was that people didn't stop developing. She was not the woman from the letters exactly. She was also not the woman who had arrived on the September train. She was someone who had grown through 30 years of living beside him as he had grown through 30 years of living beside her. Different from what he'd imagined. Better. In the morning, they started on the wheat. By fall, the 4 acres were in. By the following spring, they were green. By that summer, Caleb stood at the edge of the wheat field with Eliza beside him and looked at something they hadn't grown before on land they'd worked for 30 years. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. They stood watching the wheat move in the wind, and neither of them needed to say anything else, because after 32 years of marriage, they had learned that the best moments were often the ones that didn't require words. Some things had always been that way between them, and some things they had built slowly out of the 7 years of words that had made everything else possible. In the autumn of 1924, a young woman arrived at the ranch asking for work. Her name was Ada Price, 19 years old, from a family in Nebraska that had lost everything to the drought, arriving at the Walker Ranch on foot with a worn bag and a direct manner that Caleb immediately recognized as a kind of character that produces either disaster or excellence with very little in between. "I can cook clean, mend 10 animals, and teach the primer level if that's of any use," she said to Eliza, who had come out to the porch at the sound of a stranger's voice. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work." Eliza looked at her for a moment. "Come in," she said. Ada Price stayed 3 years. In that time, she became the school's second teacher, handling the youngest students while Eliza focused on the older ones, and proved to be one of the most naturally gifted teachers Caleb had seen, with an instinct for meeting a child where they were that no training program had given her. "How did you learn to do that?" Eliza asked her once after watching her spend 30 minutes with a 6-year-old who was terrified of being wrong, patiently finding the approach that finally made the child willing to try. Ada thought about it. "I had a lot of brothers and sisters," she said finally, "and not enough of anything. You learn to pay attention to people when paying attention is the only thing you've got." Eliza looked at her for a moment. "Then that's exactly right." Ada left in 1927 to start her own school in a county 200 miles northwest, taking with her a letter of recommendation from Eliza and a copy of the school's history, which Eliza had begun giving to every teacher who left the Walker School the way some people give parting gifts. "It's so they know what it looks like when something is built right," she told Caleb. "And if they build it differently, then they'll have built it differently. That's all right, too." She sealed Ada's envelope. There's no single right way. There's only doing it well. There's only doing. The day Ada rode out, Grace watched from the schoolhouse steps with her arms folded and the particular expression of a woman who has lost a good colleague and knows there is no efficient way to process that. She was the best young teacher I've ever seen, she told her parents that evening. She'll be even better in 5 years, Eliza said. I know. That's the part that's supposed to make me feel better about her leaving. Does it? A little. Grace sat down at the table and looked at her hands. How did you do it? All those years of teaching and then handing it off. How did you let go of something you'd built? Eliza and Caleb exchanged a look over Grace's head, the quick, wordless exchange of parents who have been asked a question they recognize. I didn't let go of it, Eliza said. I gave it to you. There's a difference. She looked at her daughter. A teacher's success is measured by what their students do when the teacher isn't there anymore. You are what I built. The school continuing, because of you, that's not lost, Grace. That's the point. Grace looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she looked at her father. Then she looked at the wall where the framed copy of the school's founding history hung the bound pages Eliza had written, which Grace had had framed and placed there 2 years ago. You sound like him, she said to her mother, in the letters. I learned to think from reading them. Eliza said it simply without sentiment. 30 years of reading the letters of a man who refused to stop hoping. It changes how you think. Caleb looked at his wife across the kitchen table. She had said it so easily, so matter-of-factly, as if it were simply true, which it was, he supposed, simply plainly without the weight of drama. 30 years of reading the letters of a man who refused to stop hoping. He had been 18 alone in a bunkhouse, writing into silence. And it had changed how she thought. The thought sat in him quietly, the way the important things always sat, not demanding attention, just present, solid there when you reach for it. He picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the cottonwood trees. They were tall now, genuinely properly tall, their canopies wide enough to provide real shade in the summer heat, their trunks thick enough that you couldn't wrap your hands around them. Planted in September of 1892, as thin sticks, they were now 32 years later the most established things on the property, older looking than the cabin, deeper rooted than everything except the land itself. You could not see the ranch from the road anymore without seeing the cottonwoods first. They had become a landmark. People gave directions using them. Turn north at the Walker Cottonwoods, people said, the way you'd refer to any fixed point of the landscape, as if they had always been there. He had planted them for a woman who hadn't arrived yet. They had grown for 32 years. They were still growing. That was what it meant to build something, he thought. You planted the cottonwoods before you knew if the woman was coming. You built a shelf before you knew if there would be books to fill it. You wrote the letter before you knew if anyone would read it. And then you waited and worked, and one day you looked up, and what you'd planted had become the landmark that everything else was measured from. Grace left after dinner, walking across the yard to the house she and Daniel had built 3 years ago, 50 yards from the schoolhouse, connected to everything by habit and proximity, and the particular gravity of a place where something important had been done. Caleb and Eliza washed the dishes in the quiet that had always been comfortable between them. Him washing her, drying the same division of labor that had existed since the first week of their marriage and had never been renegotiated because it had never needed to be. She'll be all right, Eliza said, about Ada leaving. I know. She's already thinking about who she'll find next. I know that too. Eliza set down a dried dish and looked at him. What are you thinking about? The cottonwoods. She waited. I planted them for you, he said, before you arrived, when I didn't know if you were coming or what you'd be like or whether any of it would work. He looked at the dark window that faced the creek. And now they're landmarks. People give directions by them. Eliza set down the towel. Yes, that's what hope does, I think, if you're stubborn enough. It becomes something real, something fixed. She crossed the kitchen and stood beside him at the window, looking out at the dark where the cottonwoods were invisible now, but there as certainly as anything in the world. Caleb, I love you. He turned to look at her. After 32 years, he still felt it when she said it, not the same way as the first time, that raw, terrified first declaration in a boarding house doorway, but something deeper, more certain, less fragile, and infinitely more true. I love you too, he said. They stood at the window for a while. Then they finished the dishes and went to bed, and the cottonwoods stood in the dark outside, and the schoolhouse was dark and full of tomorrow's lessons, and the ranch held its breath in the quiet of a late autumn night. The way it had held its breath for 32 years, patient, enduring, waiting to see what would be built next. The winter of 1925 arrived early and cold and settled in like it intended to stay. Eliza caught a cough in November. Nothing alarming at first, the kind of cough that went around every winter, the kind that the students brought in from the cold and passed among each other with the democratic efficiency of childhood. Caleb watched her drink her tea and dose herself with the remedies that had always worked and thought nothing of it. By December, the cough was still there. "You should see Dr. Halloran," he said. "I've seen more of Halloran than I'd like. He always looks at me like I'm a problem he hasn't solved yet." "Because you are." She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. "Eliza. In the new year, let me get through Christmas with the family." She got through Christmas. Grace and Daniel and their two children came, and James came from the Whitmore Ranch with his new wife, a practical woman named Ruth, who had grown up on a ranch herself and who fit into the family with the easy competence of someone who had trained for it without knowing. The cabin was full of noise and children and the smell of food and all the accumulated warmth of a family that had been built one decision at a time. Caleb watched Eliza move through it all, hosting organizing, managing the particular logistics of a large family gathering with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and told himself the cough was better. It was probably better. In January, she went to see Halloran. She told Caleb what the doctor said in the evening, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded, the way she always sat when she was about to say something she had already processed and was now presenting as fact rather than fear. "Pneumonia," she said, "the beginning stages. He wants me to rest." Caleb looked at her. How serious? Serious enough to take seriously, not serious enough to panic. She met his eyes. "He says if I rest and stay warm and don't push it, there's no reason it shouldn't resolve. And if you don't, then it becomes serious enough to panic." She unfolded her hands and picked up her tea. "I'm going to rest, Caleb. I'm not foolish. You're also not good at resting. I'm 63 years old. I've learned some things." He looked at her across the table. This woman he had loved for 40 years through every kind of difficulty, the brutal winters, the isolation, the fight over purpose, the months apart, the long years of building, and she was sitting across from him in the kitchen they had shared for 33 years, telling him she had pneumonia with the same matter-of-fact tone she used to report the weather. "All right," he said, "tell me what you need." "For Grace to handle the school, I've already spoken to her." "When?" "This afternoon before I came home. She's been running it for 4 years, Caleb. She doesn't need me standing in the back of the room watching anymore." "That's not why you've been doing it." "No, but it's become that a little. Grace is ready. I should let her be ready." He was quiet for a moment. "What else do you need?" "For you to stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm already somewhere else." Her voice was steady. "I'm right here. I'm going to rest and take Halloran's remedy and be fine. But you have to stop looking at me like that, or I'm going to find it very difficult to be optimistic." He took a breath. "All right. All right." She rested. She stayed warm. She let Grace run the school without walking across the yard to look in on the lessons, which was Caleb knew harder for her than any of the physical part of being ill. He moved his morning routine around her doing the outdoor checks earlier, so he could be inside when she woke, keeping the stove loaded so the cabin stayed warm. He made her tea the way she'd liked it since the first night, weak with honey, and brought it to where she was sitting by the window without being asked. She read. She wrote letters to the families who had written after the newspaper article, the ongoing correspondence she had maintained for 5 years with strangers who needed to hear from someone who understood. She reread the history she had written. She spent a long afternoon with the bound volume of Caleb's original 300 letters, reading from the beginning. "You're reading them again," he said. "I read them every few years. They're different every time. They're the same letters. I'm a different reader." She didn't look up from the page. "When I was 30, I read them as a woman who had made a choice and was trying to understand what she'd chosen. When I was 40, I read them as someone who understood loneliness from the inside. Now," she paused, "now I read them as a history of someone becoming himself." Becoming himself. "You were 18 in the first one. You sounded. By the last one, you sound like the man sitting across from me." She turned the page. "There's a whole life in here, Caleb. Not just our love story, your life. Who you were before I arrived." He sat down across from her. "Is that strange to read?" "It's extraordinary." She said it simply. "I know that word gets misused, but extraordinary, that a man could write 300 letters across 7 years and have them amount to a complete portrait of a person becoming who they were going to be." She looked up. "I'm glad you kept them. They were always yours." They were always both of ours. She set the volume down carefully. That's what I've come to understand in all these years later. You wrote them to me, but you wrote them for both of us. They were the conversation we needed to have before we could have any other conversation. He looked at his hands on the table. The same hands essentially that had held that first pen in the bunkhouse. Rougher now, the knuckles larger, but the same hands. I was afraid, he said, all the time, that I was wasting my time, that I was a fool for hoping. You were a little foolish. I know, but you were right. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. That's what matters. By February, the cough was improving. By March, it was mostly gone. Halloran pronounced her recovering with the expression of a man who had been prepared for a worse outcome and was adjusting to relief. Rest when you need to, he said. Don't push until the summer. I never push, Eliza said. Halloran looked at Caleb. She pushes constantly, Caleb said. I'm very deliberate about it, Eliza corrected. She went back to the school in April, not to teach, but to be present, which Grace had learned was its own kind of teaching. She sat in the back of the room on a chair Caleb had placed there, and she watched her daughter teach 22 students in a room that had been built for 12 and expanded twice since then, and her face did the complicated thing, and then the complicated thing resolved into something simpler and clearer. Afterward, on the walk back across the yard, Grace fell into step beside her. What do you think? Grace asked. I think you're better than I was. You keep saying that. It keeps being true. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter against the April wind. You have a quality I didn't have when I was your age. A groundedness. You don't need the children to validate you. You're there for them without needing anything back from the relationship. You taught me that. I tried to teach that. There's a difference. They walked in silence for a moment. Mama. Are you really all right? Not the Halloran version, the real version. Eliza was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods above them, that long, liquid sound Caleb had loved for 33 years. I'm 63, she said. I've had pneumonia and I've recovered, and I'm walking across my own yard in April with my daughter and the school is full. The real version is, I'm all right. A pause. I'm better than all right. Grace slipped her arm through her mother's. They walked the rest of the way to the cabin together, and Caleb was on the porch as they arrived, watching them come. And his face when he saw them, both of them, his wife and his daughter, arm in arm in the April wind, was the face of a man who has arrived somewhere he was trying to get to for a very long time. The summer of 1925 was the best they'd had in years. The winter wheat Eliza had insisted on planting came in strong. The cattle did well. The school broke enrollment records for the third year in a row, 30 students now making Grace's single room a genuine challenge that she solved by dividing the class by age and in running 2 sessions, which required hiring Ada Price's younger sister as a second teacher, which turned out to be the best accidental decision they'd made in years. Caleb was 58 years old. He had slowed slightly, not much, but enough to notice the way a good horse slows as it ages, not from reluctance, but from the accumulated wisdom that knows when something requires a pace instead of a rush. He delegated more, let the younger hands take the hardest of the physical work, spent more evenings on the porch and fewer of them at the far end of the range. You're resting, Eliza said one evening in July. I'm supervising. You're resting. She sat beside him. Good, you've earned it. 60-year-old men don't earn rest. 58-year-old men do if they've worked the way you've worked. She looked at the range in the evening light. Do you know what I'm going to do when I'm actually old? When you're actually old. When I'm 70, do you know what I want to do? Tell me. I want to sit right here on this porch and read. Every evening. Whatever I want. Without anything being urgent. She leaned back in the rocking chair. I've spent 40 years doing things that were urgent. I want to be deliberately unurgent for a while. That sounds reasonable. It sounds wonderful. She glanced at him. What about you? He thought about it. I want to watch James run that ranch. I want to watch Grace teach those children until they outgrow needing her, and then I want to watch her find the next ones who need her. He paused. And I want to be right here when I'm doing it. Right here. Exactly here. She looked at him, this familiar face, this man she had traveled 2,000 miles to find and spent 33 years learning. The face had changed the way all faces change, deeper lined, weather-marked, the hair gone fully gray. But the eyes were the same eyes she had met across a train platform in September of 1892. She had known those eyes, she thought, before she ever saw them. Known them from 300 letters written by a lonely boy in a bunkhouse who refused to stop hoping. Thank you, she said. He looked at her. For what? For writing. She said it simply the way she'd say anything that was simply true. All those years for not stopping. He met her eyes. "Thank you for reading," he said. The cottonwoods moved in the evening breeze, the same sound they'd been making for 33 years, the sound of something that had grown from nothing into something permanent, as all things do that are given enough time and tended with enough faith. In October of that year, on a Sunday afternoon when the sky was the particular blue that only Wyoming and fall could produce, clear and deep and honest, Caleb sat down at the kitchen table with a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. Eliza was in the study, reorganizing the letters. He could hear her in there, the sound of paper moving, the occasional pause that meant she was reading. He looked at the blank page for a long time. Then he began, "My dearest Eliza, I am 60 years old tomorrow, or close enough that the difference doesn't matter. I have been trying to write this letter for 33 years, but it turns out some things can only be said when you've lived long enough to know what they mean. I want to tell you that I understand now what those 7 years were for. Not just for me, though they made me into whatever I am, but for us, for the particular us we have become. A man and a woman who started with nothing but words and built a school and 2 children and a row of cottonwood trees that people give directions by. I want to tell you that I was never angry. Not once, not for a day. I know you've wondered about this. I know you've examined it and turned it over looking for the place where I should have been angry and wasn't. There is no such place. You did what you had to do. I did what I had to do. We both survived and we both arrived. And the 7 years are part of the story, not an interruption of it. I want to tell you that the letters were never wasted. Not a single one. Even the ones you received in silence, you were reading them. And the ones you wrote and never sent, you were writing toward the courage it took to get on that train. We were both writing toward each other all along. I want to tell you that the best thing I ever did was walk into that post office in March of 1885 and mail a letter to a stranger named Eliza Bennett. Not because of the love story, though, but because of everything after. The school, the children, the life we built out of hope and stubbornness, and the absolute refusal to believe that 2 people as lonely as we were had to stay that way. I want to tell you that I would do it again. Every single part of it, including the hard parts, especially the hard parts. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Eliza. And the second best thing is that you already know it. Forever yours, Caleb." He folded it, sealed it, walked into the study. She was at the shelf, standing with a letter in her hand, one of the early ones by the look of it, the paper yellowed and soft at the folds. She turned when she heard him. He held out the envelope. She looked at it, then she looked at him. "After 33 years, she said, I wanted to get it right." She took the envelope, turned it over in her hands with the same careful attention she had always given to letters, that particular quality of a woman who understood what they meant. She opened it, read it. When she finished, she stood very still for a moment. Then she sat down on the study floor, just sat down the way you do when something arrives that you didn't know you'd been waiting for, and read it again. Caleb sat down beside her, not on a chair, on the floor the way they'd sat once 33 years ago when she'd arrived in this cabin and they'd been too undone to be upright. "Caleb, this is the best letter you've ever written. I've had more practice than most." She laughed, the real one. "You've had 33 years of practice, and 7 before that." She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. Around them on the shelves, 301 letters and 50 more sat in their ordered rows. The whole correspondence of their lives, the paper record of 2 people finding each other from a great distance. "What should we do with them?" she asked. "What do you mean? When we're gone, what happens to them?" He thought about it. "Grace will know what to do. She will. And after Grace, whoever comes next." He paused. "They're not just ours anymore, Eliza. They haven't been for a long time. The people who wrote to us after the article, all those strangers who recognized something in the letters." He looked at the shelves. "They belong to all of them now, to anyone who needs them." She was quiet for a moment. "That feels right." "It is right." Outside through the study window, the cottonwood trees were losing their leaves in the October wind, golden, unhurried, drifting down to the creek bed below. The schoolhouse was still. It was Sunday, no lessons. Across the yard, light was on in Grace's kitchen window, a small warm square in the afternoon. "Caleb, do you think there are other people out there right now, writing letters like you wrote?" "I think so. Writing into silence, hoping someone will answer." "Yes. And do you think they'll get an answer?" He looked at the window, at the leaves falling, at the light in his daughter's kitchen, the schoolhouse empty and full at the same time, the cottonwood trees 33 years old and still growing. I think some of them will, he said. The ones who don't stop. She pressed her hand against his. Good, she said. That's the right answer. They sat on the study floor for a long time, surrounded by letters in the house they had built together, out of hope and stubbornness, in 300 dispatches into the dark. And outside, the world continued its turning, and the cottonwoods gave up their last leaves to the wind. And somewhere across Wyoming, a child was reading for the first time in a school that existed because a lonely boy had once picked up a pen and refused to put it down. Nothing was wasted, not one single word of it. This was what love looked like when it was allowed to become everything it was capable of being. Not the feeling, or not just the feeling, but the life built around it. The school, the children, the letters preserved on a shelf, the trees that were now landmarks. The boy who refused to stop, hoping, becoming the man the woman had traveled 2,000 miles to find. The woman who had been afraid for 7 years, finally getting on the train. All of it building toward this two people on a study floor in October, surrounded by their whole lives in paper, holding each other's hands in the quiet of an afternoon that asked nothing of them except to be present in it, which they were, which they had always known how to be, which in the end was the thing that mattered most, more than the grand gestures, more than the dramatic arrivals, more than the stories that got retold in newspapers and repeated by strangers. This being fully somewhere was someone with nothing left unsaid. 301 letters, 33 years. A love story that had built something bigger than itself. And two people at the end of an ordinary afternoon, exactly where they needed to be. The years that followed settled into a pattern that Caleb had never quite anticipated. Not the busyness of the building years. Not the intensity of the years when the school was new and the children were young, but something quieter and in its way more complete. He was 60, then 62, then 65. The ranch ran with the efficiency of something long established. James managing his own spread 40 miles north, coming back seasonally to help with the largest roundups. The Walker Ranch itself in the hands of two reliable foremen who had been with Caleb for a decade and who ran it with a competence that made him occasionally feel unnecessary in a way that felt good rather than unsettling. The school had outgrown even Grace's expanded facilities, which had become in turn the catalyst for an addition that Grace and Daniel built themselves in the summer of 1927. 3 classrooms, a proper library, and a small room they called the reading room, where the shelved history of the school's founding was available to anyone who wanted it. Caleb built the bookshelves himself. Grace watched him measuring. How many times, she asked. The measurements. Yes. Twice, he said. I've improved. From 4 to 2, that's improvement. She helped him hold the boards while he nailed them. They worked in companionable silence, the same silence that had always existed between them. The silence of people who are comfortable enough together not to require filling every moment with words. Papa? Tell me something about the letters that I don't know. He thought about it. The first one, I almost didn't send it. I stood outside the post office for 10 minutes trying to decide if I was making a fool of myself. What made you go in? I figured I was already a fool. At that point, the letter was written. Not sending it just made me a fool who'd wasted paper. Grace laughed. That's your logic. You might as well be a fool who tried. That's been my logic my whole life. He nailed the last board, tested it, solid, and it's worked out tolerably well. She looked at the shelves, new and clean, and waiting for whatever would fill them. I used to read the letters when I was little, she said. Mama would let me sometimes if I was careful. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood that you wrote them before I existed. That the reason I existed was partly because you wrote them. Caleb looked at his daughter. That's true, he said. That's an extraordinary thing to understand about yourself. Yes, he agreed, it is. He had thought about this over the years, about what it meant that Grace and James existed because a lonely boy had picked up a pen in a bunkhouse in Wyoming. About the chain of events that led from that first letter to this moment, standing in a school library with his daughter testing the shelves he'd built. It was not something you could fully account for. It was not something that fit neatly into cause and effect. You could trace the line letter to letter, year to year, choice to choice, but at some point the line became a life, and a life could not be reduced to its components without losing what made it a life. Do you think it could have gone differently? Grace asked. Any of 100 ways. Your mother didn't have to get on the train. I could have stopped writing before the last letter. The mail could have been lost, the last letter or her reply, any of it. But it didn't. No. Why? Caleb picked up his tools, looked at the shelves one more time. Because we both wanted something real badly enough to be afraid of it, he said. And being afraid of something didn't stop us. That's the only reason any of it worked. Grace was quiet for a moment, then, I'm going to put that in the reading room, on the wall. Don't. Why not? Because things on walls become wallpaper. They stop being things you actually read. He picked up the toolbox. Put it in the history. Your mother wrote it down. Anyone who wants it can find it. She conceded the point. In December of 1928, something arrived that neither of them expected. A letter forwarded from the newspaper that had published Clara Fontaine's article 8 years earlier, sent originally to the paper with the instruction to forward it to Caleb Walker if possible. It was from a man in Ohio named George Whitman. He was 41 years old, he said, and had read the article when it was published and had been carrying it in his wallet for 8 years. He was not a sentimental man or had not thought himself one, but something about the article had stayed with him. I have never written a letter to a stranger, George Whitman wrote. I am not sure I know how to say what I mean to say, so I will say it plainly. I was lonely for a long time. I didn't know it in the way you don't know something that's been true your whole life. I read what you wrote about being afraid of disappearing, about the letters being the only way you knew to be a person and not just a function. I recognize that. I'm not writing to say I'm still lonely. I'm writing to tell you I'm not anymore. I have a wife now and 2 children and a life that feels like mine. I don't think I would have had the courage to try for it if I hadn't read your story. Specifically this, that you wrote for 7 years with no answer, and you didn't stop, and it turned out you were right to keep going. I wanted you to know that. I thought you deserved to know that something you did 30 years ago in a bunkhouse in Wyoming helped a man in Ohio find his life. Thank you, George Whitman. Caleb read the letters twice. Then he handed it to Eliza. She read it sitting at the kitchen table in the same chair she had sat in on her first night in this cabin 36 years ago. When she finished, she set it down. Neither of them said anything for a while. That's why, she said finally. Why what? Why you kept writing, even when there was no answer, even when Dutch Henderson called you a fool. She pressed one finger against the letter. Because somewhere 30 years later, a man in Ohio was going to need to read that story. And he couldn't read it if you'd stopped after 6 months. Caleb looked at the letter. I didn't know that when I was writing, he said. No, that's the thing about hope. She looked at him. You can't see what it's building. You can only build it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. I'm going to write him back, he said. I know. And tell him, he paused, thought. Tell him that I'm glad and that the letters only work because someone read them. That's the part that's easy to miss. I wrote them, but you read them all those years. And because you read them, they became something real. Eliza's hand turned under his and held it. Tell him that too, she said. Tell him that part matters. He wrote to George Whitman that evening. Told him that the 7 years had mattered, and that the school was real, and that the cottonwoods along the creek were 36 years old now and still growing. Told him that 2 people who had been separately lonely had found each other through paper and ink and refused to let the distance be permanent. Told him what Eliza had said, that hope can't see what it's building, but it builds anyway. I don't know what advice I would give to a lonely person, Caleb wrote at the end. Except this: don't confuse the silence for an answer. Sometimes the silence is just the space before the reply. Keep writing into it. Keep reaching. Keep being the kind of person who hasn't given up yet. It works. It worked for me. I believe it can work for you. Respectfully, Caleb Walker. P.S. My wife says hello. She also says that the part about reading the letters matters as much as the part about writing them. She is right as she usually is. He sealed it and posted it the next morning. Riding back from town in the thin December light, with the land spread wide around him and the smoke from the cabin visible against the pale sky, Caleb felt a particular fullness that came only from certain kinds of days, the days when the thing you had hoped to build turned out after everything to have been built. 300 letters, 36 years, a school with 30 children in it, a row of cottonwood trees, 2 children and their families, and a grandchild not yet walking. A history written in a book on a shelf, letters preserved in a study, strangers in Ohio who had found their way to their own lives. Nothing wasted, not one word. He rode back to the cabin, tied his horse at the rail, and went inside to the warmth and the smell of tea and the sound of Eliza in the study doing whatever she was doing, living her life in the particular way she had always lived, it fully, completely, without apology, with everything she had. He hung his coat, poured his coffee, stood in the kitchen of the house they had built together, and listened to the sound of her moving in the next room. Then he went in and sat across from her, and she looked up and he said, I mailed it. Good. She turned a page. Was Beaumont at the post office? His son now, Beaumont retired. When did that happen? 3 years ago. Time, she said in the tone she used when something surprised her pleasantly rather than sadly. Time that he agreed. They sat together in the study surrounded by letters, and outside the cottonwoods stood in the winter field, in the schoolhouse, waited for Monday, and the ranch settled into the quiet end of another year. This was what they had built. This was what 300 letters in 36 years and the stubbornness to keep hoping had made. A life full and complete and still continuing, composed of every ordinary, extraordinary day, they had spent in the same place choosing the same thing until the choosing became the thing itself, and the thing itself was enough. More than enough. Everything. Spring came to the Walker Ranch in 1929, the way spring always came to Wyoming abruptly, without much transition, as if the land had simply decided it was done with cold and had acted accordingly. One week there was snow on the north-facing slopes. The next week there were green things pushing up through the thaw, and the cottonwoods along the creek were showing their first leaves, and the schoolhouse was warm enough in the afternoons that Grace opened the south-facing windows Eliza had insisted on 35 years ago. Caleb was 62 that spring, and feeling it in the particular way that men who have worked hard all their lives feel their age, not infirmity, not limitation, but a kind of accumulated weight, a sense of carrying the years in the body the way wood carries its growth rings. He worked. He always worked. But he rested now without guilt, which was new, and he had stopped pretending that the younger hands didn't outpace him on the hard physical days, which was newer still. You've stopped competing with Tommy, Eliza said one evening. Tommy, 42 now, with 2 children of his own, running his own small spread, and coming back to help during the large seasonal roundups. The way family came back for important occasions had been at the ranch for 2 days for the spring gather. Tommy's 42, Caleb said. I'm 62. It stopped being a competition about 10 years ago. You didn't stop pretending it had until this year. He considered this. Fair. That's growth, she said. I prefer to think of it as wisdom. Same thing. She was knitting something she had taken up the previous winter after the pneumonia on the theory that her hands needed something to do that wasn't schoolwork. The needles clicked in the lamplight. What did you and Tommy talk about today? His youngest. She wants to come to the school. Eliza looked up. Tommy's daughter. She's 8. He asked if Grace had room. Grace always has room. She returned to her knitting. Tell him yes. I thought you'd say that. Then why are you asking? I'm not asking. I'm telling you a thing that happened today. He looked at her over the top of his reading. These are different activities. She made the sound that was not quite a laugh. They sat in the lamplight of the cabin that had grown from 1 room to 4, with the letters on the shelf in the study, and the school dark and ready beyond the yard, and the cottonwoods standing in the spring night outside, and the life they had built settling around them like something that had always known it would end up here. It was Eliza who first said out loud what they had both been thinking for some months. It was a Tuesday in June, a hot afternoon, the kind that in another decade she would have found oppressive, but now simply accepted as the seasons do. She was in the reading room of the school's library addition, reorganizing the shelves with the help of Ada Price's sister Martha, and Caleb had come to find her because the supply wagon was in, and she'd asked him to check the book order. He found her sitting on a stool with a book open in her lap, and Martha gone somewhere, the room quiet around her. She was not reading. She was looking at the wall where the framed history of the school hung, not the copy in the reading room, but the original, which Grace had moved here last year, because it seemed more right that it be where the students could see it than shut away in a study. The book order looks right, he said. Good. She didn't look up. He sat down on the bench along the wall. Let the silence run. I've been thinking about the letters, she said finally. You're always thinking about the letters. No, I mean what happens to them? Really, after us. She closed the book. Grace will keep them carefully, I know that, but Grace won't be here forever either. And the school will change the way things change. And in 50 years or 100 years, whoever is here might not know what they mean or why they matter. She looked at him. I want to give them somewhere permanent. Somewhere permanent. A university or a library. Somewhere that archives historical documents. Somewhere they'll be maintained and accessible. She held his gaze. Not locked in a study, not on a family shelf. Somewhere that people who need them can actually find them. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The idea was not entirely new to him. He had thought about it in the vague way you think about things you're not ready to act on. But hearing Eliza say it with the matter-of-fact precision of a woman who had already decided made it real in a different way. They're private, he said, not an objection, a fact to weigh. They were private. Now there's something else. She looked at the framed history on the wall. Clara Fontaine read them and wrote about them, and people in Ohio carried the article in their wallets for 8 years. They haven't been private for a long time, Caleb. They've been someone else's. Someone else's. Other people's loneliness recognized in them. That's not private, she paused. That's the thing they always were underneath the love story. A man saying, I am here. I existed. My life mattered. Does anyone hear that? He looked at her. And you think they should hear it, he said. I think they should be able to, yes. Anyone who needs to. He thought about it for a long time. About the 18-year-old in the bunkhouse who had been afraid of disappearing. About Dutch Henderson, whose grave on the hill overlooking the range nobody visited. About George Whitman in Ohio, who had carried a newspaper article in his wallet for 8 years because it had told him something he needed to know. All right, he said, let's find somewhere right. The university in Cheyenne had a small archive, not large, not prestigious, but careful with what it held and committed to maintaining it. Eliza wrote to the archivist that summer. The archivist replied with an enthusiasm that suggested she had read Clara Fontaine's article and had been hoping for exactly this. In September of 1929, exactly 37 years after Eliza had stepped off the 2 o'clock train at Cheyenne Station, they drove into town in the ranch wagon with a box on the seat between them. The box contained 312 letters. 300 Caleb had written. 12 Eliza had written back. And one, the last one written on a Sunday afternoon in October 1925 in Caleb's hand, which he had decided at the last moment should go with the rest because it was the only ending that was actually an ending. They handed the box to the archivist, a young woman named Helen Marsh, who handled it with the gloved care of someone who understood what she was holding. We'll catalog them properly, she said. Each one dated and annotated. They'll be accessible to researchers and to the public. Good, Eliza said. Is there anything you'd like us to include as a note, any context you'd want readers to have? Eliza looked at Caleb. He thought for a moment. Then, just this. They were written by a lonely man who refused to stop hoping. They were read by a lonely woman who finally found the courage to answer. Everything after that is what hope builds when two people are stubborn enough to let it. Helen Marsh wrote it down carefully. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon light, the box gone, the seat between them empty. The cottonwoods were showing their fall color gold and restless, the same color they'd been every October for 37 years. How do you feel? Eliza asked. Like I just gave something away. Does that feel wrong? He looked at the road ahead of him, at the familiar shape of the land that turned south toward the ranch, the way the cottonwoods came into view before anything else when you were coming home. No, he said, it feels right. She put her hand over his on the reins. Good, she said, because it is. They turned south. The cottonwoods grew larger as they approached, solid and tall and permanent, the most established thing on the property. They had been planted as a promise. They had grown into a landmark. Now they were simply home, the first thing you saw when you came back, the thing you oriented yourself by. Everything the letters had been and everything the letters had built was here in this. A man and a woman coming home in the fall light. 37 years of choosing the same thing. And ahead of them still more years to come. Years that would contain the things that couldn't be predicted. The losses and the joys and the ordinary, extraordinary days that made a life. And both of them knowing with the certainty of people who have been tested and held that whatever came, they would face it in the same place, standing on the same ground. That was what 300 letters had made. Not a love story, a foundation. Everything else had been built on top of it and was still being built and would go on being built long after the two of them were gone, in the school and the children, in the archived letters that a young woman in Ohio or Kansas or anywhere might one day read and recognize something of herself in and find the courage she hadn't known she was looking for. The wagon turned into the yard. Grace was on the schoolhouse steps watching them arrive. She raised a hand. Eliza raised hers back. Caleb drove the horses to the barn, and the day finished itself the way all days did, with work and supper, and the lamplight of the cabin they had shared for 37 years, and the quiet between two people who had run out of nothing to say to each other and never would.